Order, order. Welcome to today's meeting of the Culture, Media and Sport Committee. This is one of our regular accountability sessions with the BBC. Now, usually these sessions are held after the publication of the BBC's annual report and accounts, which I understand are due to be published next month. But issues that you will all be aware of, including impartiality, governance, cuts, means that we were very keen to bring this session forward. And so welcome to our panel today. We're joined this morning by Tim Davey, the Director General of the BBC, alongside Charlotte Moore, who is the Chief Content Officer, and David Jordan, the Director of Editorial Policy and Standards. So warm welcome to you all. Before we start, do any members need to declare interests? Simon.
Thank you, Chair. I'm a former BBC employee.
Rupa.
I was a paid BBC staffer in the 1990s.
Evan.
I have received hospitality in the past from the BBC, and because of some of the questions I might ask, I'd also like to declare I'm a member of the Musicians' Union and the Ivors Academy, and chair the APPG on music.
I once worked with the BBC a long time ago, by which I mean in the last century, and I have attended Strictly last series on at the bequest of the BBC.
Not as a contestant, those two.
I was not a contestant yet.
I think Strictly's the poorer for that. Julie.
I've accepted hospitality from the BBC in the past.
Damian.
I have both worked for and accepted hospitality from the BBC in the past.
I've worked as a reporter and presenter for the BBC. I've worked with David Jordan, who was my producer in a whole series of films for BBC Politics. Mr. Jordan also appointed me as presenter of Week in Westminster at one point, and I've been to various BBC events.
Very good. Thank you very much, everybody. Well, that concludes that bit. So I'm going to start. Tim, how confident are you that no production set of the BBC could be described as toxic?
I think overall we're confident we've got a good culture across the BBC in our productions. I can hand to David in a minute in terms of some of the questioning around the specifics of the policies. Having said that, I think it is an area of which obviously the BBC's got a lot of experience. We've got things that have happened in our past that we've learnt from. And you are constantly vigilant, and any complacency, in my view, is misplaced. Now, with regard to that, we therefore don't just rely on good intent. We have very, very fixed policies in terms of bullying, harassment, whistleblowing, production guidelines that are rigorously enforced. So we can go into more detail as the committee sees fit, but it's a incredibly important issue. I think over time we've constantly refined and improved our processes, and I would hope we're the best in the world. They're certainly the best I've seen in terms of processes we've got. And I think also we've spent a lot of time trying to get the right culture that are supported by the policies like whistleblowing that secure the right culture. That is not to say we're perfect. There's always things you have to be vigilant for, but overall I'm confident about the culture of the BBC.
Does anyone want to add to that? David?
Well, we have a lot of policy around this area, as you might expect, and fundamentally our duty of care requirements are outlined in the Ofcom Code, but also in the editorial guidelines, where we were the first broadcaster to have due care requirements in our guidelines, supported by a whole suite of guidance, which includes guidance on working with children, specifically working with children online, safeguarding vulnerable adults and adults who might become vulnerable through their contribution, guidance on talent competitions, and for talent, and so on and so forth. So we have a lot of policy in the area. We also have a group called the Safeguarding Unit in our SSR team, which is Safety, Security and Resilience, who specialise in the law around safeguarding. So, for example, they will make sure that anybody who's vulnerable or who's a child who works in a drama is doing the things that are required by law, has a chaperone, is limited to the hours that they can work, and so on and so forth. And then all of our programmes that deal with what we call competitive or immersive programming. So competitive is obvious. Immersive is where people are, for example, living together in a house for long periods of time. All of those programmes and many others besides will have protocols specific to that individual programme, which will set out what is required of all of the people working on the programme and what they can expect. And those protocols will determine things like what happens before they even become part of the programme. So for example, we might psychologically test people to make sure that they're capable of withstanding the rigours and scrutiny that comes with being part of a major television programme that's going to be seen by millions of people, and all of the social media attention that may result in that in today's world. So we will assess people when they get on the programme. We'll have support for them during the production of the programme itself, right through to around the time of TX. When it's TX, we will have support for people, and we continue that support. And we can go into more detail if you want me to, with an aftercare service for people, so they're not just abandoned the day after the programme finishes and allowed to fend for themselves. So there's an awful lot of support work that goes into making sure that people who contribute to our programmes are properly looked after, properly safeguarded, properly protected from the kinds of issues that they might encounter as a consequence of their participation.
Thank you. So we've heard a lot in the media over recent weeks about what happens when there is an imbalance of power in the workplace, when there is the safeguarding of junior staff brought into question. So you both of you have spoken about safeguarding in answer to that question, but specifically, what is there in place to prevent a junior staff member's career being unduly influenced or in fact derailed by one of your more, you've got some incredibly high paid and powerful celebrities and others within your ranks. What is there specifically in place to stop that form of exploitation or abuse?
Well, we have very, very specific policies, which, and I'll come on to how we enforce those in a moment. We have very, very specific policies which everybody's required to adhere to. And clearly, we have learned from the experience, the awful experiences that took place at the BBC in the past. So, for example, one of the protocols that I referred to just now says explicitly any personal or sexual relations with any contributors are prohibited and will result in disciplinary procedures. All crew to keep professional boundaries with contributors, and this is not to be crossed. So that's just a quote from one of the protocols that we use in one of the programmes, and there are many more like that. I mean, for example, in a major series that we've got at the present time, or have in entertainment, we have a thing called the pledge, which is a pledge from the executive producer to all the people in the programme about how they expect that programme to be run, free of bullying and harassment of any sort. So everybody's expected to uphold those, and if they see them not being upheld, either to raise them as a line management issue, or if they feel they're not being listened to, then we have obviously our whistleblowing process, which we've beefed up in recent years to allow people to take that route. But in addition, the SSR team that I referred to earlier, the safeguarding team, now pays site visits. So it actually goes out to locations, to studios, and looks at what's going on and makes sure that the policies are being implemented properly in all of the environments as well. So we're relying on two things. One, people making it clear to us if they see these policies not being adhered to, and two, making spot checks, as it were, going in and making sure that the policies are being implemented properly.
If I may, just to answer directly, because in terms of building on what David said and the architecture of what we've got in place at the BBC, the processes are very robust. I do think from the leadership there is an absolutely clear signal, very direct, and this is born of experience. I mean, I've been personally through a number of reviews looking at the history of the BBC, and your concerns are well placed, which is imbalances of power are dangerous, and we care about them. So the first thing is, culturally at the top of the BBC, I am very, very direct that is not something I want to see in the organisation. And I think it's not about me, but it's also about the leadership being very clear that is unacceptable. And we do have imbalances, and it is a strange industry, but not wholly strange, where you've got people earning, we could we'll no doubt come onto this topic, I suspect, but talent salaries versus producers, all of that. This is an environment in which there is power in place. So the first thing is setting the cultural framework correctly. Then you underpin that with process, which is, if you like, pre-process, which is when you come to a production or when you join a team, what are the values? We spend a lot of time on the BBC values, but also policy, as David said, what you sign up to when you go on a production. Then the third part of the architecture, in my view, is the way in which, if you are facing a difficulty, you can raise it. And we have, I think there's two big things that we can talk about. One is bullying and harassment through the management process, which is I feel the work environment is not right for me. And this could be anything from disputes with a line manager. Any organisation of 20,000 people is going to have some of those running. The good news is those numbers are going down. And by the way, I would say we publish both the bullying and harassment and the whistleblowing in our annual report with the numbers, so it's all fully transparent, which I think is another important thing that we do. You've got bullying and harassment, and then you've got whistleblowing. Now, the critical thing about whistleblowing, and we've tuned this process through various phases, and I also wanted to push harder in the, or we're pushing harder after the Sorota review, so we were very happy to keep pushing, is that when it comes to whistleblowing, we are being very open and pushing it with the staff that if you have an issue you need to raise that can't go through management, it can go straight through around management to non-exec director, so you can raise those concerns. So I think we've been very, I think, front-footed about that. But to answer your question directly, if those issues emerge, that's the structure of what we're trying to put in place.
So talking about the processes that you just mentioned, when do you expect, and a specific example, when do you expect the review into what the BBC knew about Tim Westwood's behaviour to report?
Very specifically, you've got the bullying and harassment, you've got the whistleblowing. Separately, sometimes historically, or we have a very big issue that we call in an independent person to review an issue of very significant scale. We've seen this irregularly, but the very significant reviews that we've done. Westwood, the review is being led by, as you know, Gemma White KC. So it is an independent review. I haven't got control of the timing. If I was guessing, and it's not commitment because it's her review, not mine, and not the management, I would say in the next couple of months. But that's, she has made a call for extra evidence. She's talking to people, running the process independently, and then it will report.
And are there any reviews into other cases ongoing at the moment?
I don't think there's any similar reviews that I know of that type and that significance. The only, aside from whistleblowing cases being worked through or bullying harassment, the only comparable I was just thinking through, because I suspected you might ask me, is obviously we've got a review into Top Gear because we had a very difficult situation with the accident. It's not quite in the same area, you could argue, but that's the only significant programme review I think that's running at the moment.
The other issue that we've been a bit concerned about in recent weeks around this whole arena is the way that non-disclosure agreements prevent people being able to speak up about bullying or negative experiences. How much does the BBC use NDAs?
David, do you want to take that?
We don't have non-disclosure agreements anymore. We did at one point used to ask for non-disclosure agreements, but we don't enforce non-disclosure agreements with people in the BBC anymore at this time.
So to be clear, there are no staff or former staff who have complained about the culture of the BBC but can't disclose it because they're signed up to a non-disclosure agreement?
Not because they're signed up to a non-disclosure agreement. There are certain elements of confidentiality about negotiations with them and that kind of thing, which are just normal confidentiality in legal processes. But there's no restriction on people speaking up because they have a non-disclosure agreement as such. No.
Okay.
So our standard processes are that no employee needs to keep the fact or terms of a settlement agreement confidential. Yep. The second thing is, and we live with it every day, we also, don't prevent people making derogatory statements about the BBC and how it operates after they leave. That is different to some other organisations. So we don't do that. We don't have a non-disclosure. There may be some in deep history, I'd have to get back to you on that, but certainly in recent times that's not how we've operated. Yeah. The point that David's making, there is, for instance, in the commercial arm, you wouldn't want public sensitive business information or confidential information, but it's very narrow. Broadly speaking, people are not subject to that. There's another area that sometimes gets raised, which is if we are in the midst of a staff changes or going through a process and we're having confidential discussions with people that may affect people's jobs and livelihoods, publicly tweeting about that, not the policy, but the detail of that, I think is, and this is just standard code of conduct stuff of an employee in an organisation, but I would say overall we're in a pretty good state on this.
What I don't want to do is dance on the head of a pin here. So there's semantics between what's a non-disclosure agreement and what's a confidentiality agreement. I mean, clearly there's if something is to do with some kind of commercial sensitivity or some kind of negotiation or something to do with a business discussion, then that's...
Yeah, although, I mean, I would say versus my life in the commercial sector, you know, it's perfectly appropriate for someone in some of the areas we may well get to talk about publicly, you know, announced cuts. That's not what we're talking about. It's not the management that's sitting there going, well, you can't speak about your views on local radio or other things. You know, there are organisations, by the way, for that where that would be seen as way over the line. That's not the case in the BBC. I'm talking about a very specific thing, if we're kind of on the pinhead, in terms of if you've just got announcements that are confidential, you're trying to manage people carefully and with sensitivity. Aside from that, we don't have NDAs.
Damian.
Thank you, and morning all. We had the Secretary of State before us last week, and she was magnificent. In 2 hours, she said nothing of any interest, which is the perfect ministerial performance. Apart from when she was asked, is the BBC biased? When she said yes, straightforwardly, and said she slightly qualified it by saying it was biased on occasion. Has she raised any cases with you?
Not cases. I mean, the discussion we have with the DCMS is about the implementation of the Sorota impartiality plan, our overall progress against publicly declared objectives, but nothing has been raised on editorial matters, no.
What about other ministers or special advisors? I mean, there's a long history of people trying to influence.
Well, over time, if you work at the BBC, boy, do you get a lot of opinion. Yeah? There's not a BBC executive and news executive at senior level who hasn't been given the benefit of feedback on a regular basis, as you know, Damian. I mean, I think the thing we do is employ people, and I, as editor-in-chief, I can tell you my orders are very clear, which is we report without fear or favour, with due impartiality. I've never claimed we get it perfect all of the time. And sometimes we don't get it right. But overall, on the vast majority of occasions and in summary, I think we're delivering very well. Actually, we're here to talk about the work of the BBC. I think overall we've had a good year in terms of maintaining impartiality in a world in which there are fierce storms around us. And the whole of the global media market is being drawn into more partiality to make commercial return. But no, to answer your question directly, I haven't had anything raised by the Secretary of State. Ministers and other people in the past have now and again raised things, are you reporting this issue? But honestly, that is just the normal cut and thrust of how we do our business.
And is the sort of level of noise from inside government at your news and current affairs people less or more than in previous eras?
Well, I wasn't here on previous eras, but David, you might have a temperature check for us, I don't know.
I was running political programmes in the era of Alistair Campbell and New Labour. I don't think anything could get louder than that.
What about over the last 5 years or so? Is this administration more or less interfering in the previous administrations?
As you know, because there are those of you on the committee who've worked with the BBC and some in political programmes and news and current affairs. As the Director General says, there's always a constant amount of incoming from whatever government or opposition happens to be in government or opposition at the time. That's part of what you expect. The important thing is that whilst you should always listen, because people do sometimes make important points or important points of accuracy which need to be looked at. You always need to listen to what people are saying and not dismiss it because of where it's coming from. But the important thing is you take that into account and you make sure that your reports are factually accurate and reflect all viewpoints, and then they're fine. And that's true of most of what the BBC produces.
If I may say something on this, I think the noise coming in, my assessment is if you read the history of the BBC, the noise is constant. There is something different going on in the world, which you may be recognising, which is, I saw some research that most 16 to 34s don't believe any media is impartial. Yeah? So you begin, and this is really big for all of us in terms of 73% of the world does not have a free press now. People want to control the message, and I mean that broadly. People in the round want to control the message, and we have social media where they can go directly. We also have business models under enormous pressure around the world in terms of traditional broadcast media or print media. In that, it's perfectly rational, and I'm not being critical, to actually go after a particular audience and become more polarised or go after. That is not what we're doing as the BBC. And in that choice, sometimes I think there is more noise. I talk about ascribing of intent, which is if I ask a tough question of a certain politician, people will quickly leap to say, well, you're of that side or this side. I think there's something quite profound that we're going to have to fight for, and as editor-in-chief I feel very, very strongly about, which is, and this is where you see BBC Verify, you see the things we're doing, which is to say, actually demonstrate our intent. And we're not perfect. We don't get it right all the time. But I'm telling you, our intent is good. Our newsroom is outstanding at trying to find the facts and present it with due impartiality. That, I think, is a change in climatic conditions for the BBC that's material. I don't think it's related wholly to just what I might call political noise and general feedback.
I mean, the difference thing is, I mean, I take the point about external pressure, but you now have internal pressure. I mean, you know, Gary Lineker is the sort of spear point of this, where your own presenters start getting engaged.
Of course, social media adds numerous amount of joys to this particular situation, where you've got people who are not who are freelancers. They're not broadcasting on the BBC, but you know, we also forget our long-established reporters, or sorry, not reporters, freelancers. Is if you're bringing people into the world of entertainment, television, or others, it is very unlikely now that you're going to bring someone in without some kind of social media history, and that obviously adds a challenge.
That was precisely the point I was going to get to, because we've seen quite a lot of new, I mean, regardless of Gary Lineker, of news presenters leaving BBC saying, phew, I can now say what I think.
Right.
And they all have, and I don't think any of them are surprised us yet with what they really think, because we all could tell that from their performance on the BBC. But anyway, that's no longer your problem. What is that if you are looking, precisely the point, that when you're looking for future presenters, and this won't necessarily be news presenters, but entertainment presenters or sports presenters, increasingly they will have a social media history. So we might well, as viewers, all know what their political views are or what their social views are. How is the BBC going to cope with creating the next generation of stars when more and more of those stars will have established political, possibly controversial positions, particularly because they'll want to be controversial when they're trying to attract attention as influencers or so on? You know, where do you get your next generation of stars from?
It's a real challenge. I mean, Charlotte may want to talk about this a little bit in terms of looking after our television and radio output, but I think you raise a challenge. It is a challenge for us as the BBC, and I wouldn't duck that. I think there are differences, and we do see a very significant difference between those who are in news and current affairs. And we've always been, as you know, we've hired from every bit of the spectrum. We've just hired, I believe, a Times journalist, and we'll go from, we're hiring people from who have worked at GB News. We've hired from people that worked at The Guardian. So they come with a history. You know what I'm going to say, but it has worked for many years, and we can hold the line. But it is tougher based on what you're talking about, because people will dig into the history. But when you come to news and current affairs, just as you do if you come to my job or Charlotte's job, you leave it all behind, and you're fighting for something more important, which is free and democratic debate and facilitation of that. That is what we do. Now, we will be held to account. I think it's a tough choice we've made, but it's the right choice. When it comes, we may want to go further into this. When it comes to presenters beyond that, I think we are obviously doing the social media review because it's been tough in terms of where do you draw the line between social issues versus party political issues, tone. I think we want to find the right balance. I think it is not right that we say everyone across all the, and we're not there now, we weren't in the previous policy, that everyone across all the BBC is not right to show a view. And I think audiences are smart. They can say, okay, this individual has views, but they're presenting a nature programme. But that does not mean that we need to consider where we are in terms of some lines in terms of protecting the reputation of the BBC. Charlotte, do you want to say?
Yeah, I think we expect obviously to be very clear, and I think audiences and talent have been quite confused by the debate, which is why the review we felt was really necessary, because we are talking about on our platforms online, radio, TV, we absolutely ask all of our presenters and our teams to be impartial in the programmes that we make and to make sure that we show due balance and due impartiality on any subject. That doesn't mean you can't have opinions, but we need to make sure that we give due impartiality to the subject matter. This is about their own personal social media, and of course, when they are on a platform at the BBC, we ask them not to use that platform to campaign in any way on subject matters. It's very, very clear. But they're not staff. A lot of our presenters have lives beyond the BBC. And obviously we would never say that they cannot have their own social media account. We wouldn't be able to impose that. So we're very clear about what we expect from them, from the responsibility of the BBC. And if they're on regular programmes, I think they carry an added responsibility about how they use their social media. But the review which we're doing is absolutely to give clarity to this, because the discussion about party political and political controversy is something that we think we need to bring greater clarity to for freelancers and their own personal social media use.
And one of your new attempts to address this are the thematic reviews, and you've had the one on economic coverage, and one of the recommendations on that was that when you ask questions of somebody saying the government should be spending more money on X, that it should be framed in terms of, okay, if you think that, there are always trade-offs, the sort of basic economic point. Are you confident that that report has had any effect? I mean, I was thinking back to the coverage of the last budget, which was subsequent to that report coming out. I didn't notice any of those trade-off questions coming.
David, do you want to just go for it, and then I can add.
Sure. I think you make a very good point in the sense that it's important not just to have reports, but to make sure that they have some impact on our output. And in order to try and do that, Andrew Dilnott and Michael Blaston, who wrote the report, have been taking an interest in our output subsequent to the report and feeding back their thoughts, including about the budget. And I think the budget was a mixed picture. I think there were a lot of improvements in our budget coverage, but still some work to do, which you might expect for a report that appeared not that long before. We have been rolling this out across the organisation significantly, starting with a major meeting which Andrew Dilnott and Michael Blaston took themselves, which had over 500 attendees from the BBC, and we're doing that in lots of other ways across the organisation. But we do need to make sure that the sort of issue that they raised, the trade-off issue being one of them, the framing of economic debate within politics being another that they drew attention to, the way in which we look at some debates like the tax debate or things like buses. There was certainly an impact on the coverage of buses very immediately. These sorts of issues that they raised in their report do feed through to our overall output and achieve the aims that they wanted to, which is a more rounded coverage of economics.
I'm really encouraged by the thematic reviews. I think they're really, really good work. I'm sure you've read it, but the work that Andrew Dilnott and Michael Blaston did is very considered, and it takes you to a bit of a deeper subject than just what I might call basic impartiality, or because it says actually we do a decent job, more than a decent job, we do a good job. It doesn't find evidence of bias, but sometimes in this world where there's so much noise, and the idea of providing a bit more context and understanding where you stop and start a story, that is very useful guidance. And there is evidence in the budget coverage that we'll be able to, you can get drawn into income tax versus, I'm sure there's a song there, but VAT. You can get drawn into buses versus all those things. But we're an editorial organisation, so these ways in which you can deploy this into the organisation is really important. So I actually think it's an outstanding piece of work, actually. I think it will affect our output, be extremely helpful. It will take us beyond, are we just, covering off the basics, if that's even possible, of impartiality, to a properly, a lot of the issues are you covering the issue in the round? Are you showing the right perspectives? This is more than just technical impartiality, and one of the things I think is interesting is, for all the noise, for all the challenges, quite rightly, you've given me, the impartiality scores for the BBC overall, and that's what I look at. My objective is, with all the work we're doing, my only objective is we are trusted and we're seen as impartial by the public who pay for us. That's it. Everything else is working towards that aim. Overall, broadly, our numbers are flat. in the midst of the storm. Other institutions, by the way, I think have taken... It's been really tough time for institutions in terms of preserving trust. We've been very transparent. Sometimes we have difficult days at the office, but overall, that is holding up. We will continue that fight. I think the thematic reviews are very important to that, actually, as is the rest of the Sorota plan.
I mean, I agree about the thematic reviews, and particularly I was interested, as a former financial journalist at the BBC, I was particularly interested in this one, so I read it several times. I mean, again, knowing a bit about the BBC and its history, quite often you get good reports that then disappear into the mire. So what's the mechanism by which journalists will refer back to that? I mean, you say they've had a meeting. Are they going to have a continuous interest? Andrew Donis and Michael Blass.
Yeah, I didn't want to go through the whole list unnecessarily, but I'm very happy to do so. They held an initial meeting, which is still available on our what we call our gateway site internally, so anybody can watch it, and they're encouraged to do so by our BBC Academy and others. They then have talked to nations and regions. There's actually been a structural change in Wales as a result of the report, a change in the way in which they do economics and business coverage as a consequence of the findings of the report. They've held sessions with all the Radio 4 sequences, content division commissioners, political story teams at Millbank. They have reported back to the EGSC on what they think of our coverage and what we're doing well in relation to the budget. They thought there had been less political framing on live programmes. They thought there would be fewer instances of tax being interpreted only as income tax. There was more context and less hype surrounding borrowing and so on and so forth. And they noted that buses had replaced trains as the BBC's preferred mode of transport. So these things are all happening. The EGSC, the board committee, which covers editorial standards, is asking for them to come back in the autumn and for us to come back to them in the autumn and give us an indication of what's been done so far and what continues to be done. So it is a continuing programme. It isn't a case of the report's been done, it's been read, it's been put on a shelf. It is a continuing programme of implementing it, making sure that everybody's aware and that we're improving our coverage in the way that it suggests.
Your concern is a very good one, which is, I think this industry often has reports, action steps, what actually changes. So the lines you're using are very much used internally, if I may, which is how do we make sure that there's a real change in terms of how we go about our issue. And what I would say is there's been, on top of David's, I mean, the fact that the authors are still helping us, working it through. At the end of the day, the BBC is about those editors, those wash-up meetings after. I think the teams are doing an outstanding job, by the way, and they're learning from these things. And in the midst of a lot of challenges, I think we're delivering really well. And I do think the thematic reviews are going to make a difference.
Thank you very much, Simon.
Good morning. I'm going to talk about BBC Local Radio, which you probably were expecting, because you continue to face questions from staff, unions, parliamentarians, and even Ofcom about the changes, the cuts you're making to BBC Local Radio. Given these seem to have very little support, how can you continue with these changes?
I think it's totally understandable that something so precious and essential as local radio, and BBC Local more generally, when you make changes, it's very, very difficult and unpopular. And I think we believe we're doing the right thing, but it hasn't. It's a situation in which we understand and are listening, and we've already made some adjustments to our plans to make sure we're making the right choices with very limited money. The overall situation is that we, as you know, I think you're well briefed and you've talked to some of our regional colleagues and you understand the issue, but we have made some decisions around local provision in the BBC because it is so essential and precious to keep its budget flat. And you cannot avoid the fact that the BBC's had 30% of income taken over the last decade, and we've had to absorb inflation for the last 2 years. We've actually made a choice to keep more in local than the average by keeping the budget flat. Now within that, you've then got choices once you've agreed you're going to hold the budget, what you do with it. And look, local radio is precious. The connection with people who, often aren't digitally connected, all of that is absolutely critical to the BBC. There is a but, which is it does have a big audience, but it is 13% of the population. So an incredibly precious 5 million people, but it's 13% of the population. And the linear local radio market has been declining about 20% over the last few years. Sorry, in total, it's down about 20%. So with that in mind, and the fact that audience behaviour is changing rapidly, and you don't have to be a digital evangelist to look at the numbers and say that most 65 to 75-year-olds are getting their news online now. In that context, we believe that reallocating about 10% of our budget, the vast majority of the budget remains in linear broadcast, by the way, and there's not a media organisation in the world that isn't going through this kind of transformation. We believe that the upweighting the online offer is critical for local democracy. This I need no convincing on the essential role of the BBC in terms of local democracy in the regions, in the localities. And we have made a decision, as the committee I think is pretty well versed on these topics, of keeping all local radio stations open, 39 local radio, protecting where the vast majority of the listening is. Yes, there is a painful choice, which is the sharing of programmes in the afternoon, going to 20 rather than 39. You can't avoid that. That is where you cut, and then you are able to then invest in digital, where we are increasing the headcount by 130 in terms of other areas, putting 71 investigative journalists in, building 11 journalism hubs. I think that's the right decision. I really do, in terms of having a proper local offer. There is no diminishment in the appetite of the BBC to be supporting local democracy, holding people to account in the localities, and representing these towns and cities across the UK.
If I may, you talk about local radio being precious, and obviously you've had to make some changes to your proposals in light of feedback and lots of views from all different sects of the BBC and everything else. I just wondered, should you have consulted audiences before you did this? How has this been explained to these loyal audiences? If you look at radar figures, BBC Local Radio, yes, in certain areas the audience might be smaller than it was 10 years ago, but they're very loyal. They are an audience that is super served by BBC Local Radio that's been left behind by every other media because commercial radio has changed so much in recent years. Should you have consulted them?
I think we're always looking at audience research, we're looking at the numbers, we're talking to people. There's a formal process, of course, with Ofcom, which we ask them about the changes.
I'm not talking about Ofcom, I'm talking about the audience, the people who care about these programmes. I'm thinking about my constituents, who are slightly older than the average in East Devon. And the radio is their friend. Social isolation is a real problem in the UK. BBC Local Radio is that friend. Yeah. It's not going to be as relevant to them. Well, if I talk about my local radio station for a second, and sorry to take a bit of time talking about this, when these changes come in, none of the presenters, bar one, who have been there 12 months ago, will still be on air. That's a huge change to an audience that's loyal in a county that, is fairly traditional. Why didn't you consult audiences who pay for these services?
I think we're talking to audiences all the time. There wasn't a formal consultation. And I think that you've got to scale these kind of processes to the scale of change. Now, as I say, the vast majority of both listening, vast majority of both listening and listeners are not affected in terms of by these changes, because if you take breakfast and mid-morning and what we're protecting across all 39 local stations. Now I know you've talked to Stephanie Marshall and others in terms of the region, and there are specific changes I know with regard to the John Akers of this world in terms of some of the changes that have happened. So there is a bit more change within Devon, and I appreciate that. And by the way, that is a challenge when you change from, but remember, we're not changing the breakfast programming. We've got 39 breakfast programmes mid-morning. That's where most of the listening is. There is a compromise here. There inevitably is. With this financial framework, there is a compromise. And it's broadly in... I've got the Devon issue, and I appreciate that. I take the point. But there is a compromise which is in the afternoons. But the idea that we don't enable... remember, it is a precious audience. It's 13%. It's this balance of the population. My objective when I walk into Plymouth, which I have done, is that when I look at the people in the street, 50% are getting local or regional news. And particularly from a BBC local point of view, we're not just confined to a media which I love to bits but is declining and is less of the audience. I can't change the audience habits on that.
Let's just delve into the weeds a second, if I can. So some of these changes that come forward and all the different regions that have come out of it and all the different programmes that have come up, are you confident that the scoring process used in different regions to select which presenters will present different slots was robust, fair, and even nice? Kind to your employees?
I think it was robust in the right process. I think there was a balance, and I'd have to get back to you in some of the very specific details if you've got questions.
I'm not going to go into specifics, it wouldn't be appropriate.
And I was going to say that as well, we'd have to work on what's appropriate. I think one of the things we've tried to do in the process, and there is a balance here, which is in the BBC, properly discussing with unions, going through a process is you open up as much as possible jobs to as a bigger community as you can, and that increases the stress on the organisation over a time period. Because if you think about how potentially a commercial organisation would do it, it may be a much quicker process. Yeah, it would be a different process. If you look at how some tech companies, there's brilliant things that they do, but sometimes it can be a very quick change. It can be within a week. We're not running that type of process. That is kind and the right thing to do over time. But I think in the fact it takes longer does create quite a lot of stress on the organisation.
When we look at these changes, if audiences plummet across BBC local radio, which in certain regions they may, because as Ofcom has said, these programmes may not have the same relevance to their audiences, will you look again at these changes? Would you look to reintroduce local programming if radio figures fall to the floor?
I think we'll always look to maximise the use of that money on local to ensure we've got the right editorial. Sorry, I mean,
yes or a no?
It's what it means is there'll always be ways in which we'll always review how well we're doing. You'll always act on things that aren't working. Whether you go back to where, you know what I'm saying here, which is I'm not committing to go back to where we were, but you constantly look at how you use your budget. The objective for people working in BBC Local is that everyone in a community is properly represented and has their local news. That's what we'll do.
You're committed to not just managing decline of local audiences on local radio?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
I think quite the reverse. No, if I may, that's an important point. If you are, and look, I love local radio. I mean, I listen to a blend of the Today programme and Radio Berkshire coming down to know what's going on in Caversham every morning. Absolutely committed to it. 100%. We've committed to all the local radio stations.
Just briefly, because I know other colleagues...
No, but it's important. This is, you asked me, are we managing decline? Quite the reverse. If you are sitting with all your money on broadcast, you will be managing decline. That is a decision I cannot take for the BBC. I've got to be in a position where the majority of people are getting local news of the quality we produce. It's really important to the country. Now the question is, have we got enough investment to do everything and keep everything whole? We haven't at the moment, so we make some choices. But no, it's a growth agenda, not a decline agenda. Absolutely, that's the point.
And just briefly, before I pass on to a colleague who wants to continue this discussion, industrial action's been taken by journalists at BBC Local Radio, presenters and everything else like that, who are really worried about their jobs, they're really worried about their colleagues and everything else. What's your response to those industrial pickets across the network? Because they're not going to go away.
No, I'm highly empathetic to it because I think the change has been stressful, it's taken a long time, and I think it's been a very difficult time for people working in local radio with so many at risk. Now what we've done is we're beginning to take hundreds of people out of being at risk as we go through the process, and I think as we move through the process, I'm hoping we'll have more certainty for people and move that fully to a point where overall, by the way, you know, in the round there won't be a big change in headcount in local. There won't be a big change in budget. Getting from A to B is very difficult, and I understand it. I've talked to, people out there on the picket. It is a difficult time, and I'm highly empathetic to those going through it. I've been through restructures myself, and it's not nice, so I understand it. I am utterly committed to BBC Local growing for the long term. That's what we've got to get done.
Thank you, Steve.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, Tim.
Hi.
Are you concerned that your cuts to BBC local radio make you the Mr. Beeching of local broadcasting?
No, because I can understand why, and I think some of the communication I get gets into that area, which is, are we managing the decline of local radio? Have we made some kind of strategic choice to get out of local radio and local? I hope, I won't go through the whole argument again, I'll save the committee that, but it's quite the reverse actually. We actually care deeply about local, we want local to grow, and we want to keep local radio stations. We're just making some adjustments to free up some money.
No, we've heard you loud and clear say that. You said in response to the Chair's opening question, there's not a toxic culture at the BBC, and Mr. Jordan said that we have an awful lot of support for our people. Is it toxic to tell long-serving reporters in BBC local radio they can only stay on if they take a substantial pay cut and demotion? Surely that's fire and hire, isn't it? You'd expect that at P&O Ferries, not at our national broadcaster, paid for by a licence fee imposed by statute with the threat of imprisonment if they don't pay it.
I'd be very...
Has that happened? Does that not happen?
I'm not aware of that situation, but I'd have to be, you'd have to give me specifics privately or raise it, because I've been in situations where, people are offered jobs that may be at different pay ranges, but that is not the intent of the overall intent is to move to a point where we've got people in the pay ranges and paying fairly. Okay. But you'd have to give me specifics, I'm sorry, and we can't do that here. So
we can't do that here, and we can't. But what I can tell you here is that at Radio Solent, which serves my constituents, well-known presenters with years of local knowledge were asked in interviews to sell themselves in 60 seconds and told to produce demo tapes, which Dropbox receipts, I'm told, show that they never even viewed by the managers who asked for them. Now, a presenter can turn around and do a 60-second clip about a news story.
Of course.
But doing it about yourself in 60 seconds to save your career, it's workplace bullying, isn't it?
I think what the team have tried to do is get a process that is fair to everyone and level the playing field.
Is that fair? If I said to you, no, give me 60 seconds, Tim Davey, as to why you should stay Director General, is it fair? Bullying, I think
when I was interviewed for Director General, if I may, it's not that, I was given a chance to do a pitch, I was given the presentation, and I did my work. I think everyone will have a view on the process. I think the management there are trying to be fair and trying to level the playing field. Is it pleasant to go through? No.
So the 60 seconds thing is a myth, is it?
I don't know the...
Have you ever heard that before?
I don't know the ins and outs of the specifics of the process and the recruitment process because I'm not managing that.
Okay. And what I'm saying, the BBC were very, very keen to splash Dominic Raab all over its broadcasts when he was accused of bullying. And yet, right under your nose, as editor-in-chief, I am told that long-serving presenters are given 60 seconds to sell themselves. Told to produce demo tapes that are never opened.
Well, that I just... don't know, and you'd have to provide the evidence of that because I would expect people, if they're providing things to interview, for them to be seen and heard. Yeah. So that's fair. In terms of, it's a point that we have to go and look at. The specifics on the process, if I may, I think you're equating different things here. I think if you go through a process in which you're reducing headcount in certain areas of your operation, it's never pleasant.
It's difficult.
And it's really difficult. You've got to do it with, I agree, with some kindness, but you've also have to do some objectivity to it. Because we're an organisation that's going to be wants to be transparent, wants to be accountable. I wouldn't in any way link that to the cultural concerns you're raising, which are valid, but I wouldn't link them in that way.
Okay. I suppose, process is difficult. But the message that I'm getting from people in my area who I represent, who work in the BBC, who are facing this unpleasant process, is that you've talked about the modern media landscape, and you've got to respond to that. That's your job. That's what you're tasked to do by your chairman, acting or otherwise. But
not by the chairman. We're there to deliver value. Value for all audiences.
But you're tasked to respond to the modern media landscape, and you've given us a very eloquent explanation as to how you're doing that and how this fits into that. But I suppose the impression that was given when you visited Southampton was that if they don't like the modern media world, they should go and do something else. Do you think that's fair? Because that's the impression that I've been given by a number of people who were there when you visited Southampton.
I don't think that's totally fair, although the impression, all I would say is I'm empathetic. So if that's someone's impression, that's a fact. Yeah? So, and I think if you're in my job, that balance between, it's a interesting question, because that balance that we have to strike between driving change and responding to audiences versus people doing jobs they care deeply about, they're passionate about. No one's doing bad work. They're fantastic people. But getting that balance right is something we need to do, and we're trying to do it sensitively and respond. And we're here to talk about the work of the BBC. We come from a position of strength. We're not a failing organisation. No. So one of the things that makes it harder, if I may, is that because the teams are doing such a good job, these changes become very difficult. But for what it's worth, if that's how someone perceived my remarks, then I understand that. I'm empathetic to it. But as a BBC, we are trying to create a kind, empathetic culture, but also drive change so that the licence fee payer gets value. That's it. Otherwise, we won't be funding local radio. And that's what I'm trying to do.
Okay. And then sort of linked to this, if I may ask you just about, because you said about choices, it's about choices. Eurovision, which obviously the BBC stepped up in a big way. How did the finances work of Eurovision? What did the BBC have to put in from licence fee money versus what did you get from broadcast partners? What do you make out of selling that coverage? Could you just give me a sense of that?
The whole enterprise, we would claw back about 60 to 70% of the cost.
Right.
We're yet to get the final numbers. It'll be a few £1 million. Right. It'll be a significant amount of money. The net. No, the whole enterprise is a few tens of million, which you get 60, 70 back from all the various things. What I would say, by the way, if you look at, and Charlotte may want to give you a sense of what that gives you, the amount of reach we achieved, the amount of programme we achieved, and what I would encourage anyone is to go to Liverpool and look at the economic regeneration benefits of that particular spend, because the BBC, as public money, one of the things I look at is the catalytic effect of that spend. It's off the chart. It's off the chart.
The legacy.
So I think it's really impressive.
Do you have any idea, or Charlotte, any idea in cash terms what it costs the BBC?
Again, I think we'd have to look at
I know
when
you're
the
still
money comes
trying to
back
finalise it,
because it's got so many different funding parts to it. Of course, it was the biggest ever Eurovision final. The whole programming, when we had the one show going up there, the semi-finals. So in terms of return on investment, which is how we look at everything across the BBC in terms of numbers that it brought to the show, and of course the huge job it did to really for the city of Liverpool. And I think, of course, working with our Ukrainian colleagues as well. I think that sense of bringing the nation together.
Can you put me in the ballpark of what it's cost?
It cost millions, but what that will eventually cost to the BBC, I think it'll be a very good return on investment for the figures that it brought to us over that week.
You can see where I'm going. You see why I'm linking this, because if I just look at the list that I drew up of some of those choices, right? So Zoe Ball Breakfast Show, Tuesday the 9th to Thursday the 11th. Richie Anderson live in Liverpool. Jeremy Vine Show live there Friday the 12th of May. Scott Mills was live on the 10th and the 12th of May. Michelle Visage, she's obsessed with Eurovision. BBC Breakfast, they were live from Tuesday the 9th of May till Sunday the 14th of May. The One Show were relocating to Liverpool to be the official opening act for Eurovision. Cheryl Baker and The Fizz, who produced some great numbers, I might say, off the back of their Bucks Fizz work. They were commissioned to appear in Walford on EastEnders. Saturday Kitchen Live did a special show on it. The Pointless Celebrities Eurovision Special. I'm nearly done. Then we have got Today and Newsnight, and the BBC News Channel were presenting from the city, where the Eurovision Piano Party. Just a couple more. BBC Radio 1, Dean and Vicky were live there Monday to Thursday.
They had to come from Manchester.
The Archers had the thrill of Ryland stopping in Ambridge.
They did.
Kirsty Walk did a special Eurovision Song Contest episode of The Reunion. Front Row were live from Liverpool Central Library. And the crowning glory, Radio 5 Live, reflected the excitement of the song contest, broadcasting live from Liverpool. There's something of the Alan Partridge Ideas meeting. I was expecting to come to monkey tennis in this list, and I'm just, when you're firing local journalists that are producing high quality, years of experience, and they see that much going into the Eurovision coverage, could you see how that jars?
Inevitably, when you look at the balance of the budget, when you're looking at television budgets, drama, we could pick on drama budgets, how we get that balance right is one of the most defining tasks that we have to do.
But they're choices.
But bear with me. Bear with me.
Mm-hmm.
But what we've done with Charlotte's budget and others is take the content budget down. We're doing less hours. We're making 1,000 less hours than we were a few years ago by focusing. In local, I'm keeping the money flat. Okay? Now, overall, you will always be able to kind of, we are not fully driven, like a commercial operation, on return on investment. Like profit. You're looking at, it's a multivariable game, okay? And what I would say, and it's a bit like the top paid talent, you know, the top 5 do about hit 40% of our audience. These big scale moments reach people who are paying the licence fee, that are not loyalists, of huge scale. Now, the other thing I'd say is I'm incredibly proud of that, by the way, what you've just listed.
Was it a bit over the top?
I think the one thing we've learned is when the UK really goes for it, 2012, Eurovision, we do it like no other. And the BBC is an incredible part of that, in partnership with Liverpool, with all the various, you know, people that we got involved with, sitting with the Ukrainians there. It was wonderful. And actually getting the whole of the BBC to drive against it creates something of scale. The rest of Europe, by the way, are looking at going, how on earth did you pull off something so wonderful? Yeah? Our numbers are outstanding. And then I would recommend going to speak to the people in Liverpool about the economic effects. They forecast incremental hundreds of millions of pounds coming into the city and the region. Hundreds of millions of pounds. If you look at the city, we had 500,000 visitors over the period, forecast to be 100,000. It's been phenomenal. And part of that is not just turning up and shooting a concert. It's actually getting out there, doing everything, celebrating the British music scene as well. I thought it was wonderful. Okay. And the other thing, I would go and see the local radio station and talk to Radio Merseyside about how they feel about it.
I'm going to move this on.
So it was a choice, but it was a choice that you 100% stand behind. Maybe you could just write to us with when the final figures shake down, you know, what spent, what just...
Subject to BBC Studios commerciality, we'll give you everything we can. That'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Rupa, did you want to come in very, very quickly? Before you do, can I just say these are all really, really important subjects, but we've got a ton of more really important subjects to cover. So can we have slightly more pithy answers, please? Thank you.
Yeah, just on the back of the localism one, I know London's seen as being sort of a bit more protected than most, but still 133 hours to 85 hours, which it will be at the end of all this, if it happens, is a massive slashing. What I wanted to ask specifically is you keep insisting that there'll still be 39 stations, whatever happens. But I mean, if they're only broadcasting for 8 hours a day, how long is it before estate strategy says what is the point in keeping on all these buildings for 8 hours a day? Can you assure us that 5 years from now, those 39 buildings will still be fully operational?
Well, I can assure you, under my watch, that local radio will be thriving and we want the stations to remain open. I'm not going to guarantee all the property strategy because you don't quite know. What I do believe personally, and people know this, is I do believe in location, and this isn't the same in the commercial world, by the way, that having a presence in cities and towns around the UK is critical, and it will be throughout my watch.
You said it's not managed decline, but this sounds like it's a sort of gateway to these regional hubs that we keep hearing about.
That's not the vision we've got.
But then, so can you tell us in 5 years' time that those buildings are
You're assuming
still there?
that I'll still be here and other things. All I'm
or
saying
whoever
is
is there in your very big shoes.
No, but there comes a point. I can't give you more cast iron assurance than I've given you, which is I am utterly committed to local broadcasting from the locality. And across the world, we are seeing a interesting trend of people broadcasting from not within the region. And that is not something I want to see the BBC move to.
Again, somewhere like Oxford and Brighton, they're very different. They're still in the same southeast region.
Well, inevitably got the challenge of the regions and the relevance within those regions, and that's been there since forever. And there are some compromises as we make choices within our budget. But no, I can give you the assurance.
Okay, lastly on this, you said that there's not going to be a formal consultation with listeners. Can we have the equality impact assessment? Can you publish that?
I can share whatever we've got. Yeah, I need to have a look at what we've got on that.
Yeah, if you'd publish that, that'd be good, because we know there's 5.7 million people who still depend on linear all round the clock. And you'll have seen, I think, 200 different blind organisations have written for those people, that is their comforting presence overnight, whenever, all that stuff. Okay, so we await to hear that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I need to look at what's being done on that, because I don't know. So I need to just to be clear, and then we can. What we are doing is talking to a lot of people in terms of, the BBC's got an outstanding record on accessibility. We're talking to the charities. It is a concern. It's really important we do that.
You're doing stuff to bring the digitally excluded online, because all of us get emails.
We're doing a vast amount. Again, to the chair's comment, we're doing a vast amount. We can share that with you.
You can write to us on that. Thank you, Rupert. Kevin.
Oh, shall I come in on mine now, Chair? Yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
please
Okay.
do.
Thank you, Chair. Tim, were you as surprised as the Daily Telegraph that a Welsh-speaking state-educated woman was deemed appropriate to be appointed as interim chair of the BBC?
Not surprised at all. I know Ilan, and she's an outstanding candidate to be chair.
I'm very pleased to hear that, because it was an extraordinary headline. I don't know if you saw it in the Daily Telegraph.
I saw the headline. I didn't go much further, but okay. Yes.
Can I ask you about the orchestras and BBC singers, and can you briefly give us an update on where we're at since the suspension of the proposed cuts? Would that be Charlotte?
Yeah, I think that's probably one for me, isn't it? I guess I would start by saying, just to reassure everyone, that we are absolutely committed to our classical music and our performing groups provision at the BBC. We've been the biggest commissioners of music, and we're one of the biggest employees of musicians in the country, and we've been that for some time, and that is absolutely our intention to go on doing that. We spend £60 million annually on classical music, so this is all framed in our absolute commitment to this role continuing.
You said you have been, but you're saying there's a commitment for that to
absolutely,
continue.
this is everything that we are doing is to make sure that we are fit for the future, and our performing groups and our commitment to classical music can continue.
Some people think that after the proms, all these cuts will be back on the table, and the suspension will sort of have been proved just to be a little bit of an interim move. Is that wrong?
This is absolutely wrong. This is all about us trying to find a new model for our performing groups and classical music that is fit for the future. The classical music review that we did last year came up with some very good recommendations that the musicians' unions and in fact most of the classical music sector absolutely approved of, that we felt we could have a greater impact with education, that we could partner more with orchestras and performing groups across the UK, including amateur and professional choirs, that we wanted to open up the classical music industry to more people, and that we also really wanted to look at how can we grow classical music audiences. We are in a real crisis, I think, in the classical music sector, and I think for the BBC to be looking at what role should we be playing in the future that fits our public service mission, I think is absolutely the right thing to do. We know that in state schools, I was absolutely horrified that our review revealed that only 15% of state school children have any access to classical music education, which is why thinking about how we use the money that we spend on classical music and with our performing groups to increase education, to increase the impact we can have across the UK. I do think that it's not just digitally we can do that. I genuinely think live music is something that is so inspirational for new audiences and for young people to realise that this is a sector that you can be part of.
Okay, well,
so
I'm glad you're expanding the education side. It will be difficult to replace the hollowing out by the government in the last decade of music education in our schools, obviously, but I'm glad you're doing that. I just wonder whether you could, perhaps to save a bit of time, actually, because we've got limited time this morning, whether you could write to the committee, so just confirming the total amount that the BBC and its performing groups spent commissioning new classical works since 2019 in each year, and the budget for commissioning in 2023, so we can have a little idea, because I agree with you how important this sort of commissioning is in the sector. Is hugely important.
And new commissions have to be an enormous part of that.
And BBC's role in music more broadly is hugely important. And you will know, Tim, as well, I've raised this before here, my concerns, I might raise some of this in another question, about how some of the structural changes in the BBC might affect the BBC's record on commissioning and on making sure that composers and performers are well and reasonably remunerated. But if you would you be able to write and provide that information to the committee, which might save us a bit of time with further questions on that particular topic. I also want to ask you, and I know that this is you, Tim, or probably Tim, actually. I've asked you about this before, about the future of Maida Vale studios, and originally the BBC tried to get it delisted, but that didn't happen. And as I understand, it went out to tender potentially for people to take it. That seems to have disappeared into...
the sale process is ongoing.
Why is it taking so long?
Because they're finding a buyer, and the right buyer at the right price. So that process...
But I mean,
I can't talk into it, but the process is happening and ongoing. And separately, we can use the proceeds as part of our overall budgets to do this. I mean, I think East Bank is going to be stunning, by the way, in terms of a real hub for classical music, for music performance. And, I'm very encouraged by it, because I think the frank truth is, I'm sentimental as you are about Maida Vale and some of those studios, but the rebuild cost was off the charts, so we've made the right decision.
Look, I'm not sentimental about it, and actually I would welcome the right decision being taken that ensures that it doesn't get turned into a block of flats, which I don't think is going to happen now, since that previous plan was headed off. But I am wondering why, since as I understand it, some months ago there were, the tenders were, or rather the things were in place. So when can we expect some sort of news on it?
I can't confirm the exact timing.
Will it be this year?
Hopefully, yeah. No, I just want the right deal for the BBC, and I'm confident we'll see that through.
Right. So, okay. Look, I'm not going to press you any further, but I think it's extraordinary you can't even say that it'll be this year after...
the reason is for any of us have sold a house. I'll be celebrating on completion, put it that way, but we're working our way through.
Okay. Can I just ask you about... I'm not going to go into the impact of the licence fee settlement, because I think you've actually outlined quite a bit about what the impact of that has been. But the outgoing chair, Richard Sharp, said last August that the BBC was reviewing alternative funding models alongside the licence fee. What's been the findings of that review?
We haven't completed a formal review. What we are...
Is there a formal review underway, or what kind of...
No, let me explain where we are. So we do quite a lot of work looking at people's preferences around the licence fee, why, support of the licence fee. That is ongoing, and as we move towards the next charter, there's no doubt about it, we need to look at how the BBC is funded. I actually welcome the government saying, and Lucy Fraser was referring that the government will do some work on BBC funding. That's absolutely appropriate. And also, I can't remember these words, but she said the BBC is funded appropriately. That's absolutely right, and we get the right funding for the BBC. So we do work, and by the way, we track very carefully in terms of support for the licence fee and how that's working. As we move towards a charter, there's no doubt we need to look at what are the right... It's absolutely the right questions to go into 27-28 and saying what's the right way to fund universal public service broadcasting, which has never been more important in the world.
Are you worried about what the cost of living crisis, the impact that's having on the affordability of the licence fee for licence fee payers?
Without doubt. So you're very, very... you're preaching to the converted on this, in that my... strategy in the top team is very, very clear. We want to offer outstanding value for £13 a month.
This committee...
That's it's important, this, because what we're finding, by the way, is around us prices being driven by competition, as you know, all other utilities way ahead of the BBC. So, and we have, and Charlotte can talk about it, inflating costs in terms of drama and delivering. So there is a real tension, because at the end of the day, you have to offer that value for the people. We're there to serve. And that value is critical. Yeah. We are, in terms of a review of the year, I think it's extraordinary that the return investment we're delivering with our content. We've had an outstanding year on content. Think about drama. 2 years ago, this committee was saying, were we even going to be in the game on drama? Actually, we've had a thanks to Charlotte and the team, we've had an excellent year on drama. But what I would say is, there is no doubt we are conscious that it's a tough environment for families out there. And households.
And this committee concluded, when it did its review into public service broadcasting a couple of years ago, that you can't propose scrapping the licence fee without actually having an alternative in place, proposal in place. I presume that's an assertion that you still strongly agree with.
I think that makes sense.
Yeah, okay. Can I also just ask you about BBC Studios and commercialising of some BBC programming with that? Are there other areas of output that the BBC is considering commercialising beyond where it's gone already?
Shall I answer about audio?
Yeah, if you want to,
Are you referring to the audio production that we are moving?
Yes.
In order to, yeah.
And any others that might be on the cards that we don't know
Audio
about.
production is the one that we are looking at the moment, obviously subject to regulation. This is moving about 10% of our production teams in audio to really take the opportunity that we can see in the growing podcast global market. We think there's real opportunity for some of those programmes and podcasts that we think really have both global appeal but also a longer on-demand shelf life. And this is the thing, that the juggle of how we spend our money on our content at the moment is about keeping our radio stations really strong, but also thinking about this very fast-growing podcast market and thinking about, we have some of the best speech producers in drama, in factual and in entertainment, in the world, I think. So how can we make sure that we use the opportunity for a small percentage, between 60 and 70 people that we would look at going to studios in order to grow a mixed genre audio production unit there, with the view that will bring money back in that can then go towards keeping our radio stations really strong.
Will commercialising more and more programmes in this way ever replace the licence fee?
No, not for.
What's the sort of maximum
decade?
sort of
we do this
revenue?
We've been through this a few times. It's really important because people do come to me and say, you make billions on it. So the commercial arm has been an outstanding success story. As you know, it's doubled its revenue in the last 5 years, pretty much, and the EBITDA margin is strong versus competition. It's good, but it gives you, say a couple of £100 million. So we doubled it. So an audio is not going to get you there, but doubled the studios business. You'd get to 400 million. The licence fee gives you 3.7 billion. It's 100 to collect. And some of the conversations we've had about the precious things we do, there's two thresholds to answer your question directly about what goes into studios. The first is, are we facing serious talent drain? Because keeping people in the public service, like the best natural history programme makers, felt that they were being restrained in terms of what they could personally get as their rewards and also their projects. So it's about creative exploration. When Netflix, Disney and all these wonderful companies enter the scene, you begin to lose some talent. Yeah?
Some people might say that's just a way of hiding the salaries you're now
no, of course not. Of course not.
To publish.
Of course not. That would be a superficial and ridiculous way, if I may.
What's ridiculous about it? It's true, isn't it? You don't have to. Once they
it would be ridiculous to. It would be ridiculous to
the
move.
BBC didn't want to.
Bear with me. It would be ridiculous to move people into a commercial arm and commercial entity which has to be commercially viable just on the basis of some transparency thing that we're not trying to hide when we've got in public service. It's simply because when we constituted studios, if you're competing in the market, we would then be in a totally uneven position where if we're pitching for projects, if one person's salary is revealed and another's isn't, it becomes impossible commercially. So it's nothing to do with it's nothing to do with us corporately. To be very clear, not one.
And it's not a way either of not, as we were just discussing, paying, for example, composers their royalties rather than insisting on buyouts and using commercial pressure to do that.
I'm not sure that relates to studios. If I may finish very quickly, Chair, is the two criteria, because it's direct to the question, two criteria by which things move to studios. Are we facing talent drainage at the UK and the BBC and people moving out? And the second is, can you have a commercial business? Because the commercial arm is not a subsidy project. You have to make it work. That's why on audio, we've been very selective and said there's a particular area of the market where we were losing people around podcasting, international audio, and we've taken just 10%. But there's no way you're going to take everything into the commercial arm because it's got to make a margin. So it doesn't work like that. And we're very, very selective. What I would say, by the way, it's been phenomenally successful. I mean, thank goodness we did it to secure supply. I can't tell you how important it's been to make that structural change.
Does it pose any threat, though, in your view whatsoever, to the BBC's public service obligations, this trend?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say is all of our commissioning power resides, and the people who choose all that you see and watch are absolutely sitting in the public service side of the fence, and they don't have to buy from BBC Studios. That's how the thing is constructed. So that is, of its essence, the structure. The second thing is, having run BBC Studios, as you know, one of the key selling points of BBC Studios is we are driven by the BBC's values, and we are a public service entity at our heart. That's why we're so successful commercially. And we're not trying to beat Netflix, we're not trying to beat Disney, we're doing something different. So actually, what are the most successful titles for BBC Studios? They are our natural history titles, strictly. They're the things that we value as licence fee payers, and that will continue. I want to protect some of those podcasts we've done.
Well, I would also say that the commercial sector and the indie sector gives us some of our best programmes, from Once Upon a Time in Northern Ireland to Best Interest last night to the Michael Tippett show that we've had on last week. So I do think the public service values are led by what we commission and where we spend our money and the integrity of the pieces that we're commissioning, and therefore that can come from the commercial sector.
Thank you, and congratulate you on Once Upon a Time in Northern Ireland, which I've watched and which every member of Parliament should watch.
Thank
you. It's an absolutely brilliant programme. And also congratulate you on Eurovision. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you, Kevin. Clive.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks for coming to give evidence today. Can I just take you back to the complaint system and the impartiality? So, according to the figures that we've got, the Ofcom received 594 complaints in 2021 about due impartiality of the BBC. So roughly 20% of those, 555, weren't pursued. But Ofcom didn't consider that they raised issues warranting an investigation. 2 were referred for investigation, and the other 537 were referred back to the BBC. Could you just take us through what the process is there? How do you deal with those 5? And is it every case of a complaint of due impartiality that goes to Ofcom to sift through before they come back to you? It just seems the way these figures are laid out seems to suggest they do.
No. We operate what's called a BBC First complaints process. Mm-hmm. And that means that complaints about BBC output have to come to the BBC for an attempt for us to resolve them before they ever end up with Ofcom. And we have a stage 1 process where we essentially give people, if we can, a precise answer to their complaint, but in general what you might call a sort of industrialised answer to complaints, because we often get many complaints about the same subject. And we offer them an opportunity to come back to the BBC if they find that answer insufficient, and what we call our stage 1B process, where they get a more bespoke answer if there's some aspect of their complaint that we haven't taken up. After that, in the BBC First system, the complainant can move on to complain to our Executive Complaints Unit, which is independent of all of our programme makers, and they come to an independent view about whether they think that complaint is merited. And those 3 steps, in an average year, the BBC receives between 200 and 250,000 complaints. In an average year. Had a couple of very unaverage years for a couple of years ago, but in an average year. By the time it gets to the ECU, we're down to 700-800. They then assess those and make an independent view, and some of which are upheld. But anybody who's not satisfied with that decision can then appeal to Ofcom. So by the time you got to Ofcom, you've narrowed down the numbers very considerably from that 250,000 total that we started with. And we're talking, when you get to Ofcom, about 300 or 400. The figures that you're talking about are, some are the ones that have gone through that process and are on appeal. The others are people who've mistakenly gone to Ofcom first rather than the BBC, and so what Ofcom does is then refer them back to the BBC so that they can go through the process that I've just described.
Okay, so the Executive Complaints Unit in 2021-22, they upheld 14 cases, of which only 3 related to impartiality. Is that right?
In 21-22,
yeah, and they dealt. That's similar to the figures that were in
21-22. They dealt with 654 individual complaints, and 95 were either upheld, partly upheld, or resolved.
Okay, so not 14 cases as the figures I've got here.
No.
Right, but how many were upheld on due impartiality, which is what really?
On due impartiality at the ECU level, we don't have data for ECU level, but in 2021-2 we had about 20% of our overall complaints were about impartiality and bias. of all of the total complaints that we received.
Which were upheld? Or
no, they were just the total number of complaints.
Right, okay. The figures we have is it was just 3 for that year and the previous year. And I'm just trying to get a picture of where we are in terms of complaints about BBC impartiality, because, I mean, how many thousands of news items would the BBC deal with in a year?
Yeah, I think it's not just about the complaints process, because what we do is we try never to get to the complaints process if we possibly can. So if we have a lot of complaints about a particular something that people think is not impartial, and we agree with them, then at that point we say we agree with you and go back to them saying we agree. And we don't have therefore people going through the complaints process because we said we agree, and there have been kind of outstanding examples of that in the past few years. So it's not just about people who've gone through the whole process. We may well have said, yes, you're right, that wasn't as good as it should have been, and that's the end of the matter. It wouldn't show up in the figures that you're talking about. What is critical, if I could say, is that in the period since 2017, when Ofcom took over the responsibility for accuracy and impartiality complaints, as well as everything else, Ofcom has upheld one complaint that's gone through that process I've described in all of that time on impartiality.
And was that the case of Ruth Davidson?
Correct.
Yeah. So that, I mean, it appears to me that is a minuscule number compared with the number of news items that the BBC would deal with in any 1 year.
Yes, it is. But that's what we're aiming for. Because we're aiming for, I mean, if that figure was 0 all round, we'd be delighted, because that would mean that people weren't finding fault with our impartiality process and weren't finding fault with our complaints process, then that would be the ideal situation. They don't always accept that our answers are right, they don't always think that our output is impartial, but they are satisfied by some of the answers that we give them when they complain.
So when we asked the Secretary of State whether the BBC was impartial, she was emphatic that it is. Where would you think she gets that from?
Well, she said on occasion, if I may.
She said on occasion,
Let's just
yes.
get the clarity of the words, yeah.
We were biased on occasion, I think, were the words of the Secretary of State when she appeared.
Well, she said it several times, so it depends which phrase you take.
What phrase are you referring to? Just so we can
I think the BBC has been biased, and I want to raise it with them, and I will speak to the Director General about it. I mean, that seems to be consider that she thinks there's a serious problem. I think that's pretty clear, isn't it?
I think that there's constantly, in my job, the question of impartiality and due impartiality gets raised, which is appropriate. By the way, I think the linking that directly to complaints is important and helpful, but it's a broader topic than just complaints. What I said earlier, and I won't go on, is that in terms of our record on delivering against our editorial guidelines and against the code, from an Ofcom point of view, we are doing well, then the numbers speak to that. So I take your point.
So when the Secretary of State raises it with you, can you enlighten us about what you might say?
Well, if anyone raises it with me, I do what I've already done in this committee, which is firstly I take you to the overall data. We're serving the public and audiences. There will be enormous noise around the BBC continually. So what we do is we go to the public and what they think. And overall, our numbers are pretty solid on impartiality. Now, so I share the data. The second thing I do is accept the BBC isn't perfect. And sometimes it's more than just technical impartiality. The thematic reviews it's deeper than this. It's how are we covering taxation? How are we covering, local democracy? These aren't technical questions of, did we get a report finely balanced, or can we pass our own very tough test on editorial guidelines? They're about, are we doing a world-class editorial job? We are, by the way. We're doing outstanding work, and I thank you for your comments, because we are doing well. But I think any complacency is misplaced. It's just wrong. And I simultaneously hold those views. I think that's what you should do in my job, and that's what we should do as editorial leaders. And just here to be wholly defensive as the BBC is the wrong thing. But our record and the complaints record speaks to it, I think is exceptional based on the pressure around us, and it gets to our processes, the editorial guidelines, and what we do as the BBC. I think we should be very proud of it.
Yeah, I mean, and your review of impartiality on the coverage of taxation and public spending, also found that there was no willful bias.
Correct.
But what he did find is that there was general ignorance on the subject matter. I just want to mention a pet hate of mine, so indulge me. I listen to the Today programme in the morning. I'm an avid listener to the Today programme, and we get the journalists who are on the programme questioning an expert, and then they question the politician or whoever is coming on the subject matter. What you don't get is the excellent journalists like Ben Chew, Chris Mason or Hugh Pym actually questioning Hugh Pym, in the case of Hugh Pym, the Secretary of State for Health, or our Shadow Health Secretary. Why isn't the expert journalist the person who does the interview?
Well, we deploy both tactics, that's what I'd say, but I note your feedback. I'm more than happy to pass it to the newsroom.
Well, I've got that off my chest. Can I ask you? Can I ask you about the Counter Disinformation Unit?
Yes.
Does the BBC have any contact with the Counter Disinformation Unit?
We did have an attendee who went to some meetings to talk about disinformation. The person who attended was not. This is deliberate. Was not directly in the news from the newsroom, and it was, in my view, I looked at it. It seemed perfectly appropriate, which is just to look at information, rumours circulating about during the crisis, and absolutely fine.
And the communication from the Counter Disinformation Unit, has there been any, for instance, indications that there are any individuals that they would rather you didn't interview or have on air?
I haven't seen that. I haven't seen that. By the way, we wouldn't take guidance from that kind of body on who we interview.
I wanted to give you that opportunity to say that.
That would not be appropriate, and we wouldn't consider it.
So, for instance, the Daniel Kazita story, which was covered by Newsnight, who was disinvited from a defence conference where he was a speaker. I think I commend the Newsnight for actually covering it, but there has been no comeback from the government about the item that you covered on Mr. Kazita, for instance.
No, not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
But I think the government knows what the answer would be if they queried that.
Well, clearly they might think otherwise. So you're required to alert Ofcom of any potential serious editorial breaches. Have there been any in the last year?
There have been some in the last year, yes, but and we've notified Ofcom of one since we entered into this agreement with them. All of our serious breaches are reported in our annual report every year in full as part of the report of the Editorial Guidelines and Standards Committee, because they're all reported when they occur, which is thankfully not that often, but when they occur, they're reported not just internally to the Executive Committee that deals with this, which I chair, but also to the Editorial Guidelines and Standards Committee chaired by Sir Nick Sirota, which is the board committee on the subject, and they're then in turn reported to the board. So we take those very, very seriously, and we also take the actions that we need to take as a consequence to make sure something similar can't happen seriously as well.
So last question really for me is about Gary Lineker. Do you regret how it was handled? Is there anything you've learned from the Gary Lineker affair?
Well, it's certainly a busy weekend. I regret audiences are impacted at the end of the day. I always, the idea that we didn't put out a full programme, I'd always regret. So, do you look back and say, could you have done things slightly differently at different points? You always do in these affairs, of course you do. But yeah, that's where I am.
And you're happy with how he's tweeted since?
That hasn't been a concern of mine. What's been a concern is getting the social media review to a point where it can be delivered flawlessly. And that is not easy. And John Hardy's doing his work, and we expect him to report back to us as executive pretty soon.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Can I just quickly take you back and just ask again, were there any potential serious editorial breaches since the annual report was published, David?
No, there hasn't been. They're all going to be reported in the next annual report, up to and including the last one that's happened.
Thank you. And then I want to talk very briefly about the chair of the BBC. Can you just tell me what's changed since the BBC did their independent review into the conduct of Richard Sharp since his appointment?
I'm now speaking as a unitary board member, because obviously the the chair is my boss, so I just put that caveat in. But very specifically, the unitary board, the board of the BBC, NOMCO, had some process recommendations that if the group have read that report, which specifically led detail greater attention paid to disclosure of relevant personal and professional interests at the start of meetings, making sure that's utterly robust, looking at assessing the board's code of practice and guidance to make sure they were clear enough that personal and political as well as professional and pecuniary relationships should be considered for disclosure, just checking the wording is perfect on that, and to make sure that the diarising of board members meeting senior political figures, including social events, were diarised and notified to the BBC so that all the records are perfect. So it was essentially some process points around the NOMS committee. Those are now being implemented through the board. As a board member, I'll take a paper on that implementation, I think, imminently.
Thank you. That was nice and brief. Tell me, one of the things that doesn't appear to have changed is the leakiness, in the sense that Richard Sharp was widely briefed in the media as the government's preferred candidate prior to 2020, and we were all well aware of the fact that Damian was likely to be the interim chair about a week before that was made public. Where's that coming from, and what's the impact of that on BBC stuff?
I don't know where it's coming from, and it's unhelpful.
And what's the impact of that on BBC personnel and staff?
Well, I think always leaks are unnecessarily unsettling. I think if you work in the BBC in public life, and the members of this committee will be only too aware of, it's just not ideal to have processes that aren't confidential throughout. Do I know where that comes from? Absolutely not. And the BBC's got an absolute vested interest to keep total confidentiality in these things.
And there's no plans to have any kind of review as to where that came from?
No.
Okay. Looking ahead to the recruitment of the new chair, what are you looking for? What are the quality and skills the BBC needs?
Well, I think, again, I do put that caveat in that we're talking about the person who's going to manage me. So, but as a board, I think this is an incredibly precious institution, globally admired, complex, right in the heart of the public eye. It needs a world-class chair. And we need an outstanding candidate to do that. I think from a board point of view, we absolutely believe that a transparent process is critical. It obviously has to be someone who can champion the impartiality and the independence of the BBC. That is utterly critical. I think it's useful to have demonstrable experience, and we've had this in the past, in terms of demonstrable experience in the sector, and they understand this industry. And I think appropriately, I'm sure DCMS will consult us as a board as part of the process. So that's where I am. I think this is an incredibly important job, and it's also a special job. So I think we want a world-class person to run the BBC.
We'd all agree with that. But are you confident that the government's going into this recruitment process with the right approach?
Well, I think one is, I think, if you look at the report, the technical process, it was well run. I'm only looking at Heppenstall's words, and overall, I can't speak for the government, but I've told you I think it's best if I just leave. This is where the BBC board want to be, and this is what we want to see happen. And personally, I look forward to that process being run properly and absolutely by government.
Thank you. Julie.
Thank you very much, Chair. I want to move on to completely different areas. Women's sport, which is completely different than what we've been talking about. I think Barbara Slater's done an amazing job in recent years in having more women's sport on TV and more crucially at watchable hours. But what are your plans to grow viewership of women's sport as we head into major tournaments across sport this summer?
I think it's we've obviously been massive supporter of women's sport for the last decade and more, and as you say, Barbara Slater's done a fantastic job, not just in getting the rights for as much, but also covering women's sport across all of our online radio, TV whenever we can, even if we don't have the rights, and I think that's incredibly important for us going forward, that we absolutely focus on that. and growing women's sport across that decade, from going from BBC Two to BBC One to giving it greater prominence, to absolutely thinking about how can we grow women's sport. So it's absolutely right at the heart of the schedules is something that we've really been focused on, Barbara and myself. Thinking about how we do that beyond women's football as well. Obviously, we've got Wimbledon coming up, we've got the cricket, there's rugby we've supported, going into next year with the Olympics, again, will be a big moment. Really thinking about how we can have equality for our coverage for both women and men, and thinking about that in terms of our presenters and our expertise and how we talk about women's sport editorially. I think has been a big part of what we do. So, look, I would say we've been at the forefront of that, and that is absolutely something we're committed to continuing.
And this year we've yourselves and ITV haven't been able to agree a broadcasting deal with FIFA for the Women's World Cup, and we're 5 weeks away from it. Do you think that's an acceptable place to be?
Obviously, I can't discuss commercial negotiations like that in detail, but safe to say that we are big supporters of women's sport, and of course we are always trying to have, properly competitive bids to make sure that we can cover as much sport as our budgets will allow.
If we look at the last Men's World Cup, that was agreed 8 years out, and we're 5 weeks away.
And I think it's really important that we continue to have those negotiations in the right way, but of course we want to do everything we can thinking about value for money for our audiences, and whether tournaments are live in peak or whether they're through the middle of the night and where they're placed. And we take a huge amount of care and detail about how we make sure that we don't overinflate the market, but we really help the market grow. So we're looking at that.
From what I understand, it's the bid has been less than 10% of what was agreed on the Men's World Cup 8 years ago. Now, I know you can't comment on the exact figures, but it's been well reported, so I would suggest we're in the ballpark arena. Is that really how we equalise the coverage?
We really look at fair value for everything that we do, and the BBC has a strong track record in paying, absolutely the right price for things, and as I say, really market assessing and audience assessing and looking at the variance for each bid that we put in. And that's our promise to the audience, and to licence fee payers.
You agree something. I just want to make a comment on regional political programmes, which we've talked about extensively over the years in this committee, and the problems of live versus recorded. Can I just say that this weekend was a classic example of why live broadcast is better, because the Sunday programme in the North East was recorded at 4 o'clock on Friday. We had the former Prime Minister resign as an MP, we had another MP resign, and during what would have been, if it had been a live broadcast, we had the former First Minister of Scotland arrested. So the programme put out on Sunday was, perfectly fine, but bore no relevance of the politics of the weekend. And I think whenever you do look at that in the future, it's things like that you really need to focus in on. I'm just saying that as a comment.
Noted.
Yeah.
And I want to move on to something else. I loved Eurovision, by the way. I thought your coverage overall was brilliant, and you really, knowing Liverpool very well, as one of my daughters lived there for many years, I thought you got the atmosphere and the feel of Liverpool perfectly. But the other big event that you've covered this year was the coronation. And I think your coverage was excellent. I have no issue with the coverage. But I watched the programme, and I can't remember the name of the programme, on the Saturday morning that deals with complaints from viewers, the points of view, that's it, which I often listen to. And there was overwhelming discontent with the amount of coverage on all channels. Virtually every viewer that was that their comments were read was complaining that there was just no choice, and there wasn't any choice for hours and hours and hours. And most of these people were people who wanted to watch the coverage, but the person who was responding from the BBC was basically saying there is choice, there was choice, and there absolutely wasn't. And I went back and looked at the programming, and there absolutely wasn't choice. And it's a theme of that programme. I mean, I think it's a good programme on a Saturday morning where people can, points of view are raised and what have you, but it's always defensive from the BBC. Why is that the way you handle that? Because you can say you think it was the right decision to have this blanket coverage on every channel, but to say there was choice when there clearly wasn't was wrong. Why is the approach so defensive from the BBC?
I don't know the specifics of that. Of course, the choice they might have been referring to was iPlayer, which obviously has lots of choice and on-demand choice at any time. And I think the decision that we took on that Saturday was that we had an accessible signed version of the coronation on BBC Two. So it was a decision to make sure that we were as accessible as possible with this big national event. But I think you make a fair point, and I'll go and look into the spirit of if you think that's defensive.
Because I do think if people take the time to complain in a light sort of way, not going through the formal complaints process, I do think the BBC shouldn't be so defensive and actually engage sometimes.
Listen. It's really important we listen to ideas.
I take a lot of what you're saying on tone. I think it is important. We're there to serve. And I think the BBC actually, this is me being defensive about defensiveness, is I think we've changed our tone quite a lot in the last couple of years. I've been working on it personally in terms of how we respond to people. I think often people just want to be heard, they want to be listened to, as opposed to, frankly told they're wrong in every regard. And I think your point is well taken. When it comes to that particular issue, by the way, I think the fact we did an accessible version on BBC Two, I do think we learnt quite a lot actually through the two momentous funerals we had to cover in terms of what I call the clutch control of how much choice you offer and how you don't. And you're never going to get it perfect. I think broadly, based on the level of income we got for the coronation, which I'm incredibly proud of our coverage. Remember, we had to deliver the concert the next day. The BBC did that with DCMS, and then Eurovision. So it was incredible. No broadcaster in the world could have pulled that off. I was so proud of the teams. And broadly, we've talked about complaints. It was contained and balanced. And I thought we showed a lot of perspectives in the right way. So look, I take your point more broadly on tone. I think it's a good one.
Thank you. I thought the coverage of the coronation, and of course you can never have too much Eurovision as far as I'm concerned, all very excellent. But can I just take you back very, very quickly to that women's sport, talking of tone and defensiveness. It's widely known that the deal for the Men's World Cup was nailed down 8 years before that tournament took place. Here we are, just over 5 weeks out of the Women's World Cup, and still we're not sure we're going to be able to watch those games that take place over in Australia and New Zealand. What sort of message does that send out about how our broadcasters, our national broadcasters, not just the BBC, value women's sport?
I think we would all share the intention to get these things nailed down, because for productions it's incredibly important. So I think it's in everybody's interest to sort these things out, but I can't comment on commercial negotiations that would obviously affect those decisions.
I mean, to what extent does the BBC,
we're absolutely committed.
The BBC value? Let's just have a sort of your thoughts on the way that you value women's sport at the BBC.
We are doing everything we can to make sure that we obtain the rights for as much of women's sport as we can within the budget and the funding envelope that we have, and we make those decisions across a year, and we go into negotiations at the right time when those bids come up, and we have to go through a system that we don't always dictate the speed of that financial situation, but obviously from our point of view, rest assured that it's in all of our interest to make sure that we get to that deal as soon as we can in order to be able to be, fit to be able to produce any event. So genuinely, and this is obviously not just a BBC negotiation, it's across the whole of, it's many countries all trying to come to the right decision. Yeah. So we're doing everything we can to make those deals go through. But of course, it's not, I can't dictate the pace of that.
Right. It just feels very...
Which feels very difficult for everybody.
It feels quite distasteful, not least because we're much more likely to come in with some silverware from that.
It's not something we've had before.
Yeah, okay, thank you. John.
Thank you very much, Chair, and hello everybody. Could I begin by looking at the issue of unequal pay and women at the BBC? It's an issue that we've raised many times as a committee. Now, we all noted that your former presenter, Donna Traynor, went to an industrial tribunal in Northern Ireland, which was settled. She received compensation. Have you now won any case at all against any woman?
There's only been one that's taken to tribunal that's gone all the way, and there's been one against us. That's the number I know, which is Samira Ahmed. In terms of the
the situation on equal pay, if I may, is actually a good story for the BBC.
I think the women think that.
Well, that's because, as you know, we had to do an enormous amount of work, sort through the issue, and we're now at a point, I've just looked, at the moment we have 8 equal pay cases open internally within the BBC. These are worked through, and we'll see if there's any issue. Now, that's an achievement versus where we were. We've also got the pay frameworks in place. We've got really good systems. So, look, when we get to a situation which we go to tribunal, no one wants that. All we're trying to do is make the right call in terms of what's the right thing to do with licence fee payer money, and that's what we did in this case.
Well, why do you keep fighting cases that you lose?
Well, we didn't lose, we settled.
We all know you lost. You had to pay her a lot of money. She would have settled before the tribunal, but you took it right to the wire.
We did
the BBC lost.
We did not lose the tribunal.
Well, your lawyers agreed on a form of words whereby you did not accept responsibility. We had a rather strange talking interview from the big boss there in Northern Ireland, which was less than gracious. But nonetheless, the BBC staff that you lost, you had to give her a lot of money. She would have taken that money if you'd offered it to her privately, but you chose not to. Now, I've got the amount that you spent on lawyers' fees. September 2021, the BBC told this committee that it spent £1.1 million of licence fee money fighting equal pay cases. Extraordinary waste of money. It's our money. It's licence payers' money. Can you update us on that figure? How much have you lost now?
I haven't got the figure in front of me for 22-23, but we'll obviously be able to give you that.
Yeah, we'd really like to know that, because that's a very important case. Can you understand how angry this makes licence fee payers, apart from the distress for the women concerned, who are having to battle you year after year of this incessant battling with the BBC over something that's a matter of natural justice? Licence fees think this is an extraordinary waste of money.
Well, you never want to be spending money in dispute with your staff.
And don't do it.
Simple as that. What you also need to do is fully accountable and transparent in terms of, as you can be, because you can't talk about individual cases, but you want to be making the right calls in terms of whether you think you've done wrong, whether you haven't done wrong, making it right. I think the BBC's done enormous work in terms of making sure its employment practices, equal pay, the way in which we're paying people within published bands now, it's transformed.
But we had to drag you kicking and screaming towards this position. It was this committee that recommended the presenters' pay be published. Now, I know that Mr. Jordan was against that at the time, and said that it was a poacher's charter and that would result in a massive departure of BBC staff. Your predecessor, Tony Hall, said he had got this wrong, the BBC had got it wrong. It was this committee that had recommended it. So it's not a good use of public money, and it's an area where you yourself have agreed as an organisation that you were wrong.
I stand by my comments, which is, I think, firstly, we've made significant progress. We can all go through the history of where we're at, but I think the BBC now is an exemplary organisation in that. As leader of the organisation, I can tell you, I don't want to fight. There's no point in fighting legal cases where you think you've got an overwhelming case of losing. You take legal advice and you make a call. And we're very, very conscious of spending.
How many people are you still fighting against?
Well, I think in terms of the, as I say, we've got equal pay cases of 8. That's it. I'm not sure on the tribunal number. I'd have to send you that.
Mr. Jordan looked at me surprised when I raised his name. I mean, Mr. Jordan, would you accept that the BBC was wrong, that you were wrong, and that the pay should have been published?
I'm not aware of having made a comment about that. I think the previous Director General made the comment about the Poachers' Charter, as my recollection.
Okay. Now, as you know, people tend to drop me quite interesting emails about their situation. I have it in good authority from a number of sources that a number of your presenters are sitting at home being paid by you on full salaries, on gardening leave. Can you just confirm that's the case?
I wouldn't confirm. I'm not going to talk about specifics of presenters.
Talk about a group.
What we will do is, often in a reorganisation, there'll be people where you're putting someone, working out where they're going to go into the organisation, and they may be paid for a very short period of time. You never want to be in a position where you're wasting.
Well, this isn't a very short time. They've been sitting at home for quite a long time, actually. And here's the extraordinary thing: you've got that group of people. They're disproportionately women, by the way, and they're disproportionately, interestingly, people who've challenged you about equal pay. So a number of them feel, not unreasonably, that they're being punished. So while they're sitting at home, and we, as licence fee payers, are paying you to pay them to sit and do nothing, you're hiring freelance people to sit in the studios and to present the news.
Look, news management will always make a balanced call which says, are we doing the right thing for the licence payer? I'm not going to talk about specific cases. And I think it's right that I do that. I can say categorically, by the way, that there's no question that anyone would ever be punished in the way you're talking about. I think that is not how we work. That is not how we work, categorically.
So can you confirm that you have a group of presenters who are sitting at home on full salary?
I'm not going to go into specifics of presenter arrangements.
At the same time as you have a group of presenters sitting at home on full salary, doing nothing at home, you're hiring and paying for freelancers to go into the studio to do the job that the group of people at home aren't being allowed in to do.
You're into a very small number of people where specifically we are having discussions about their future. I'm not going to do that with the committee. I think we're making... I understand the point. I think we need a fair, good conversation with those individuals to make sure they're settled. That's where we're at.
That's smaller number.
While we do that, I'm not going to get into specifics because I don't think it's fair. But in terms of while we're doing these things, you're always going to have in a scheduled bits where you're going to use freelancers. That's
not that smaller number, but you're not denying this group of people.
What number are you talking about?
Exist. I think the problem is if I start to identify that it's more than 5 and under 10.
Thank you.
And I have from a number of different sources, not necessarily within that group, but out with that group, that this is true. I also have it in good authority that they're disproportionately women. I also have it in good authority that a good number of them disproportionately are fighting you over equal pay for women. And I notice you're not denying any of that. So can I just confirm, since you're not denying that while these people are sitting at home, you've taken on freelancers
I am not
to do that job?
I'm not getting into specifics about individuals and their contracts.
Clearly.
So, it's not a question. So separately, I think anyone in a situation that you're describing, the key is the BBC deals with that fairly to its values and comes out to the right conclusion for the individual and their career. That's what we should be doing. Meanwhile, if there is work going on of that nature, then in any circumstance and any news schedule, you'll be using freelancers to fill some of the gaps. So absolutely.
It's clearly absurd to be keeping people sitting at home who want to work, who are not being allowed to work a job that they've done for a long time, that they're very experienced at doing, while you hire freelancers to do exactly the job that they're qualified to do. Let's move on to the issue of the BBC chair. What do you think the fallout in terms of reputational damage has been for the BBC over Richard Sharp?
I think one is I think we've had an effective 2 years at the BBC under Richard Sharp's leadership. This has been a well-led organisation, and in his dealings with the board, myself, he's acted with integrity. Now, there is no doubt that when he chose to resign, then the perceptions of impartiality, he refers to it himself, which is the perceptions of impartiality, the BBC, are material to the BBC. That's what Heppenstall says. Perception is material in effect. So I think once you get a situation in which that's been questioned, then rightly, then you reach the decision that Richard did.
It's one of the bizarre facets of the whole system that you at the BBC don't choose who your boss is going to be. It's odd. Nobody would set that up as a system. Instead, the Prime Minister, in this case Boris Johnson, chose Richard Sharp. People will know by now that Richard Sharp gave a lot of money to the Conservative Party, that he facilitated a loan for Boris Johnson, which of course he denies, but then he didn't tell us about that. It was a terrible mess from beginning to end. Wouldn't it be a lot better if the BBC was in a position where you could hire your own chair and actually choose somebody who knows something about broadcasting?
Well, look, as I've said, there is limits to where I get involved personally in terms of views, because I think it is appropriate. I mean, I'm hired by the board, hired by the chair. I think it's for groups like this and others to discuss the balance between governance and looking after the public interest in running the BBC versus the BBC itself. We just talked about complaints and Ofcom. That I think that's for others to decide the balance. What I can tell you as Editor-in-Chief and a board member is what we see as critical to running the BBC, which I've done earlier. I won't repeat the list, but I think it is really important that we have someone who can champion the impartiality and the full independence of the BBC. We agree on that. And that's actually critical. I also think, we need an individual of extremely high competence. We have a complex set of issues, whether it's look at the span of issues we've covered in this committee, everything from Eurovision to local radio to commercial. You need someone who can grasp the breadth and depth of the BBC and make the right decisions, and also hold the executive to account and some of the decisions they're making.
I agree with you about all of that, and that's why it'd be really good to have somebody who knows something about broadcasting. And of course, poor old Richard Sharp had to go into hiding during the weekend sushi that you had with Gary Lineker. Normally, the chair would be out fighting BBC's corner over such a controversial case over a weekend like that, but of course, he couldn't. Now, you've set up this independent inquiry over what people can say if they work for the BBC as presenters. And full disclosure, I've been interviewed by John Hardy, who's doing this. I spoke to him for about an hour, and he asked me lots of very good questions.
Thank you for your contribution.
About this. It was a great pleasure to give my contributions. Do you know what the results of his inquiry are?
No, he's talked to me a number of, like you, in terms of interviews, and he's, the reviews is indications of the kind of field of play you're in, which is how much you restrict, how much you free, all of that balance. But we're waiting the final report, and then we'll make. Then we can take that and then construct the guidelines from that.
Okay, well, I can let you into a secret. My understanding is that his report will probably conclude the kind of common sense position, which is that if you're a news presenter, you're not allowed to say anything on social media that identifies your politics. If you're not a news presenter, if you're a sports presenter, or a natural history presenter, you'll be given a lot more leeway to express your views. And if you're freelance, you'll have a lot more leeway than you will if you're staff. I think that's what most people think is a kind of common sense position. My understanding is that's what John Hardy...
I'm surprised you're preempting the review in that way, because we're not. I'll wait for the review.
Well, I'm an MP.
To the earlier...
I'm an MP. I don't work for the BBC. I can preempt away, and I think that would be a very good conclusion, and I think that's what the conclusion will be. I mean, looking back, you've been asked about this previously in the course of today. It wasn't great for you personally, was it, that weekend? Because you told Gary Lineker to go away and apologise. He didn't apologise. He reappeared at the end of the weekend, and he kind of won that particular tussle with you, because he went back on screen, didn't have to make any concessions. You had to concede an independent review, and the independent review, I think, from the sound of it, will probably back the Gary Lineker position rather than the Tim Davie position.
I wouldn't preempt the review. My position, I think that's a simplistic reading of the situation, if I may, because we were very clear, which is, I think that we've always said that if you're a freelancer to the BBC, that construct, by the way, that you've described, which is, I wouldn't preempt the review. I think John needs to do his work and then deliver the review. But that construct has always been something where we've said, what's the difference between someone who's a freelance, we've talked about it earlier in this session, the freelance, where those lines are versus news and current affairs. I believe that.
Now, we did have a situation, look, it was, as I said earlier, it was a difficult weekend. You get to a point where you worry about viewers and you make sure you've got things back on air. But actually, we needed to resolve the situation, and how to do that was to get a review and try and get some common ground so we can move forward. That's what we do.
You didn't do that on the Friday, you did that on the Monday after all the presenters refused to come into the studio. You could have done that before that happened.
Well, hindsight's a wonderful thing, as you know.
Well, yeah, but at the end of the day, it's your job to kind of try and preempt as much as you can on these matters. And you were tough with Gary Lineker, and then you had to retreat with Gary Lineker. In terms of the BBC board, what effect do you think that had on your own standing? Do you think you still enjoy the full confidence of the BBC board?
That's definitely not a question. That's one question you can ask the BBC board.
What about the BBC executive?
Well, I hope I've got good backing of the BBC executive team. I think overall, I suspect I know where you're going. In terms of, it's been a tough time within the staff base. So I'm sure if I may, do you want to ask the question around the staff survey? I'm assuming that's where you're going.
That's mine.
Why don't I ask the questions and you just come in with the answers, depending on which member of the committee want to ask them. So, in conclusion, you do think that the BBC executive still have confidence in you. Finally, can I just ask about languages, minority languages, because that's an issue that we're interested in, because we're going to do a committee report on minority languages, and as you'll know, it's in the media bill, which is very welcome.
Yes.
The Irish film The Quiet Girl was nominated for an Oscar recently. It was Irish Gaelic. Do you think it's possible that a BBC-funded Gaelic film might achieve that kind of level of success? Because there's a great deal of talent, creative talent, being incubated through BBC Alaba, and I just wonder where minority languages will go. What's the next stage, having put all this work into BBC Alaba? The Irish still seem to be ahead of us. It'd be nice for us to be punching at that level.
I think we'd really welcome anybody who wants to write for a wider platform. Absolutely.
When was the last time a programme in an Indigenous, non-English language was broadcast on Network BBC?
I don't have the details for that. Looking some of our Welsh programming.
It was done in both languages.
The Welsh,
BBC Wales.
Exactly. Hidden, was it called? I can't remember what it was called.
I think the very fact you're all looking at one another, not quite sure, I think that's quite indicative.
We would welcome it. Again, we had a big commissioning day the other day, including all of our commissioning
Why not
team.
do it?
So absolutely, I would welcome it.
Because we see in the new media bill a commitment to regular programme, which is, and I'll quote, in or mainly in a recognised regional or minority national language. Now, those languages are Welsh, the Gaelic language in Scotland, Irish, Scots or Cornish. Now, as far as I know, there have never been network programmes in most of these languages. I'm guessing from your reaction you think there has been in Welsh, but it's certainly very, very rare.
I will look into that.
You can, yeah, good. Thank you. I'd welcome that, because I know the committee is going to do a report on this, and I think there's general agreement across party that more minority languages encouraged to flourish is good, because we all know how beneficial it is for kids' education if they speak more than one language.
And I think we've done an enormous amount of work in the last couple of years to really think about how we co-commission with our colleagues in the nations and regions and how we work creatively together, and I really think there'll be more of that going forward, so absolutely think it'd be a great thing to do.
Okay, thanks, Chair.
Can I just make one point, which is, one is I welcome the challenge. I think the idea we're getting more, the programme we were struggling for was Hinterland. We got to H, Welsh drama beginning with H, it was Hinterland, which was in both languages. But I think the challenge is good. The one thing, if we're taking stock of the BBC, by the way, is it's been a triumphant year in terms of pushing drama and commissioning outside of London. We'll do more drama in Wales this year than we've ever done. Yeah? And there's more programme making across the UK than we've ever done. And that across the UK strategy, I think, has been fantastic. Could we take more scripts with local languages? Absolutely. And I think that's a very interesting challenge to us, actually.
So what do you want people to do if they've got the scripts in Welsh or in Gaelic? who'll take...
I often get this from people with scripts in their pockets, so I don't know whether I don't know whether this is a pitch, but anyway.
What I'm saying is that
what I'm asking is who will make this happen beyond aspiration to development and production and broadcast?
We have our writers' rooms across the whole of the UK, encouraging people to come with their scripts, and of course we now work in a much more pan-commissioning across the whole of the nations and regions. So I would encourage them to go to the commissioners, and will absolutely.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Just very briefly, last year's annual report showed your pay gap increased in nearly all areas, but most noticeably for disabled and LGBTQ plus people. Are we going to see that improve this year?
Are you talking about median pay gap?
Yes.
Yeah. I don't know, but it may move a little bit up. It may move a little bit that way because what we've got is, I would say a couple of things going on. One is we're best in market versus benchmarks, media, and I want to remain totally best in class. You're right, if you look at the long-term trends, across most categories actually we've been improving. Disability is the one that's still, the number is low, but it's not really moved. So we need to do more work in terms of ensuring we're getting more senior disabled staff, people with disabilities moving through the organisation. That is definitely a challenge. So the answer to your question is I'm not sure. It may move up a bit, but it will still be best in class. The reason I'm not utterly obsessed by median pay, I think you need to be really careful about this, because what you want to do is also make sure you're putting women into the organisation, things like tech areas where you go in, you're recruiting a lot of people. We need to reshape the senior team, keep reshaping the senior team. I'm proud of the work we've done. By the way, the BBC is majority women now in its 100th year. It ticked over 50%. It's an amazing achievement, and I think we'll keep pushing. But what I want to do is make sure that we're not just trying to gain the median number. I think the committee should look at the numbers by level to make sure you're absolutely flawless. And to the earlier challenges, there's no equal pay issues, and we're doing absolutely flawless in terms of, we're all over this in terms of the operation committee and where we're at. Having said that, there might be areas like tech when I want to inject apprentices where we're putting in that may affect that number slightly. What I would say is we will remain, and we want to be, well ahead of the market and well ahead of our media benchmarks. I think the BBC needs to be a role model in this.
Thank you very much. To bring us in, Rupa.
Yeah, how would you describe staff morale at the moment? You alluded to that survey, the latest BBC staff survey. Less than a quarter of staff had confidence in the senior leadership team, and that's gone down by 20% in the last year. And on some of these other questions as well, the one about the BBC being in a position to really succeed over the next 3 years, that's only been answered positively by 28% of people. Even the traditional, the BBC is a great place to work one, figures seem to be plummeting on last year's one for all of these metrics.
They're not all plummeting. It's a mixed picture. So if we can share with you a bit more detail on it in terms of, and by the way, that number doesn't sound right in terms of, it's not a great number, but in terms of the confidence in the executive team is not
We're looking at it.
1 in 4. It's higher than that. Having said that, I think it's been, when you're driving this amount of change, it really is very tough. And I think, to be honest, the survey came in a period where the BBC was, I'm not excusing it, but right at the heart of the news. There's a couple of issues going on in terms of that we've already talked about in this committee. So it was a tough time. I think we have work to do to constantly make sure that people are, we still have outstanding numbers versus our peers in terms of proud to work for the BBC, management, local management numbers were going up, career development going up. So I could give you a lot of the numbers that were going up. But I take your challenge, and this is specifically related. You see a understandable, and I'm highly empathetic to it, you see it specifically related to areas where we're going through very significant change, and it is tough. It's really tough.
I mean, I've been a social scientist. You can easily fix these figures with leading questions, but I mean 55% of people agreed with the figure, I believe, in the BBC's strategy to deliver value for all audiences. And I think this local radio cuts, which has been the underlying thing that everyone's mentioned, there was the lobby last week. It can't be great for you to have a massive data breach where staff's ID numbers and I think NI numbers, date of birth, all that sort of stuff has been splurged. That can't be brilliant. And also to be accosted on a picket line to have to cross a picket line last week on your way to work. I'm glad you engaged with them.
That's what I'm here for. I mean, I absolutely want to talk.
But what are you doing to fix all these malcontents on the survey?
I think what we're trying to do is we are absolutely trying to work through change as sensitively as we can. But it's not. This is tough work. I think we need to ensure that as a team we're listening. We go into the survey, we understand what's causing some of those numbers, and we do our work. That's what. But my job is not simply about driving those numbers. And by the way, we don't game the questions. We're quite, we're quite.
I sometimes use this as a bad example.
No,
of teaching.
I know, but you can't have it both ways. In terms of, I understand what the numbers are tough, but there are some companies we were in the middle of two very significant issues at that point. Now, I'm not excusing that. I think there's a lot of work to do, and all organisations where you're going through this amount of change, you get challenging numbers. Could we do more? Of course we can. And I think communicating with people, talking to people, I do believe that we've got an outstanding executive at hiring good leaders. We're seeing actually in the survey, one of the glimmers in there was actually the work with the managers. I'm struggling a little bit. I understand the staff morale with the link. We can talk about the data leak, which was not from within BBC systems. The way you said the BBC's the data
the company said it as well. Yeah.
So we might want to talk about that. But
are those people being protected and supported?
Well, yes, we have. I mean, obviously, we've been very proactive. I mean, I don't know how many organisations are affected by this, but you'll see the BBC went straight out. I have an urge to transparency, so we were very, very clear. All the staff have been communicated and told what data is at risk. Separately, we have a world-class team working with authorities as well in terms of scanning the internet to see what is emerging. Linked to that, we're also giving people a link to a service and offering that to everyone so they can have their data looked at and see what's out on the web. So we're doing a full package of that. There's another issue with the BBC, which obviously individuals are making sure, and we manage this on a day-to-day basis anyway, because we have lots of people doing brave work in places like the Perthshire service and others that are under enormous threat. So I think we have world-class systems in terms of contacting. That has to be an individual plan, by the way, for individuals and how we support them, and that's how we deal with it.
And the industrial action would have been noticeable to anyone watching local TV, not just you're saying that there's all these non-existent linear people, but anyone watching, there'd have been all these new faces that you don't normally see.
What do you mean? I just understand non-existent.
People who are not listening to local radio, you don't have to be a local radio aficionado to just know that at 6 o'clock turn on your TV, there's all these new non-normal faces. These are people that are being paid. I think John Nicolson alluded to it as well. These are freelancers who are being paid. You said to us today, I never want to be spending money to settle disputes with staff. Can you tell us what the overtime bill, in fact, what your staffing bill has been between April to June compared to April to June last year?
We'd have to give you a number because we obviously haven't got that in front of me now.
Or can you get it? You're going to get back to us with the equality impact assessment on the audiences for the radio changes. Can you at the same time?
Well, the latest data on that, and then also in terms of the process we've been through, and then separately we can take that request and I can see what we're allowed to share.
It'd be good to see like for like, because again, it's public purse, it's taxpayers' money. You want to deliver value for money. If you've got your own staff who are on a picket line accosting you on the way to work, when you could settle with the unions, Vector and NUJ, if you sat down and had that conversation, it just seems all wrong that we are watching these non-payroll people that are getting a higher rate for, it must be costing us all, right? Would you accept that?
Well, look, it's regrettable we've got action in the way we have, and we'll do all we can to keep talking to the unions and try and resolve it. That's what we're here to do.
Okay, it's not good value for money, and you're going to provide us with those
I'm going
figures.
to provide you with what I can within the constraints of confidentiality, just to be very clear.
I hope you're not wriggling out. Okay. I mean, is there not also an issue of, I think in the trade, and I've got family in the BBC still, I used to work there before, this whole acting up thing, that people are doing roles outside of their pay band. This is how you can... This is not a sustainable system, that people are doing additional things for which there's no pension contribution. And so if you just had a rebanding process and just everyone was actually being paid for what they did, you wouldn't have to rely on goodwill.
To be very clear, we have had a very good rebanding
When was that? Because that would be news to a lot of journalists contacting me.
No, we may be talking about cross purposes, to be fair, because they'll know that we've got the pay performance bands and the whole architecture of how pays works is a completely different orbit to where it was. I think, I have some sympathy, but if you've got a organisation that's got too many placements acting up, all those things. And we do this from good intent, because you give people career opportunities. I've acted up on occasions. I think I acted up during the Savile crisis. Is you act up, and that is a good career opportunity. So there's a balance here. But what I do agree is that shouldn't be the norm. And I think
if you paid everyone according to what they're doing and their skill set,
I think overall, with respect, but you get paid to act up. I take your point about the wider situation, but the overall, we are trying to get, if I look at the situation, I think we're improving in terms of how many people are in more permanent situations, and I agree with you that that's the ideal situation. What I don't want to do is have a situation there isn't some movement where people can get placements or acting up. You see, it is a bit delicate, this, in terms of making sure we've got an organisation where career development happens, because a lot of people will say, actually, I got an opportunity to act up, proved I could do it, got the job, it was fantastic. So it's a balance.
Yeah, just relying on people's goodwill is not really sustainable.
I'm not relying on goodwill on that.
People cover an extra shift. People.
I'm not relying on goodwill. We're paying people to act up. That's not goodwill. That is an agreement with the employee. They're not, or the member of staff. There's no question of,
Those extra hours aren't subject to the normal. If it was in a salaried contribution, is it?
If you're extra hours, that might be more on a freelance. I'm talking about people who are on a salaried role acting up. That's not. There's no element of them having to do that. Now, there's other elements to the freelance contracts which we could debate, but I think the BBC. I mean, this is quite a detailed conversation for this hour.
Okay, it's a thing about grading. But look, is the BBC ageist?
I don't think so in the slightest.
So, I mean, actually, it was on the cover of Sunday's Telegraph. James Booth, the lead singer of. Tim Booth, the lead singer of James, you might remember Sit Down.
I know James extremely well.
Yeah, so he's claimed the BBC is ageist because of the he's 63 years old now. He's not lost his looks, but he's not getting the airplay he would like. Is the BBC ageist? Not just him claiming that, but actually, if you look at London local radio, some of the people who've been moved to the shifts that will be axed, ultimately, Jo Good, she's a lady of a certain age. I think she was moved to an evening shift. That's one that's going to go when this axe swings. And also, even they go on to Radio 5 at night. That was against their wishes. We're just seeing a diminishing, aren't we, of local radio?
Radio is absolutely not ageist. It's important that we constantly evolve, and some people will leave, and we give opportunities to new people, and the BBC has always done that. We have an enormous age range of presenters, both on television, on radio, across all of our stations. But naturally, all stations and all channels and all programmes evolve, and we have to give new opportunities. We've got an extraordinary track record in bringing in new talent, and I think that's something that is within absolutely our public service mission, is to give opportunities to new talent. And so we're constantly evolving, and actually, the competition is such at the moment that there's huge competition out there, and a lot of people choose to leave for, very good commercial reasons, and I wish them well. But we therefore have to move the schedules and evolve the schedules, and that's something editorially we do all the time and have always done.
I think the worst thing the BBC do is attempt on its core services some lurch to youth. You've got to look after your heartland audience, and I know we've had this debate about it, but you have to look after your loyal audience. The BBC has to do that, and it's critical. And I would say, if you look at our record on employment record, but also our playlists, radio. There will always be people who have issues with our playlist, by the way. Different artists, different ages. I've got plenty of up-and-coming young talent who would love to be on the Radio 1 playlist, and there'll be 80s artists, which I know only too well, that will be annoyed that they're not getting the playlist. I respect that. But just to be clear, I do think, as Charlotte said, it is important in the creative world to refresh. So, we did not want Ken Bruce to leave, but I think Vernon Kay is an outstanding broadcaster and delivering a fantastic show.
On the afternoon.
That's how it works.
There is a sense, though, that when these people get old and expensive, they're dispensed with.
Well, I'm just telling you that's not true.
Andrew Neil... Actually, there's even the same story where Tim Booth was quoted. The headline is BBC recruiting to curb liberal bias. There's people like
Sorry, I'm trying to equate the 2 points. I'm aware of the various Daily Telegraph headlines. I'm just
you're
trying
on the cover. You're on the cover here. On Sunday. So I mean, Lewis Goodall is another one who said that he was sort of hounded out. I think when people get to a certain level, so it's easier to get younger.
I don't recognise that.
Expensive.
I don't recognise that in the slightest, to be fair. I think if you go in the newsroom, and I'm more than happy to introduce you to very experienced editors, long tenureships, some outstanding talent. Reporters of absolutely all ages. In fact, we've got a wide cohort of ages and gender and disability and diversity. I think we've done an outstanding job over the last year on it, quite the reverse of what you're saying.
Is there any truth in this headline then, BBC recruiting to curb liberal bias? It says it's an unusual move because it's not just people on the
question
screen.
comes from a minute that was a discussion at the Remuneration Committee, which is perfectly appropriate, which is how do you ensure you're getting the widest range of people coming to the BBC? And if you read the minute, I think it gets there, which is it says you don't do it by the views. What you do is do what, and this is defensive. This is what we have done, which is we're one of the only organisations in the UK to set a socio-economic diversity target. So we've said 25% of the BBC. We're at 21.1, or it's 20, just over 21 because it's moving a bit, but 21% from lower socio-economic backgrounds. It's parental income at 14, you could do a number of measures. We are driving that number and looking at our senior leaders as being accountable for that. That is what's happening in terms of the BBC. But I refute the idea that we're, just driving in the agenda in the way you're talking.
I mean, because the thing, I don't know, your flagship, so on the liberal bias point, your flagship current affairs programmes are Question Time and Any Questions. They're often complained about that sort of the panel looks a bit unbalanced. So you've got Conservative Cabinet Minister, maybe Ken Clarke, person from right-wing think tank that doesn't disclose its funders, person from the media who's very right-wing. Is there any sort of consistent guidelines on how those panels are drawn up?
Well, what Mentor, the independent company that makes Question Time, does with input from BBC Scotland, which manages that process, is to try and achieve over time a wide range of contributions from a wide range of people with a wide range of views. And I think over time, Question Time does that. There may be criticism of individual editions of the programme about the precise balance in that one, but over time they make sure that they have represented all the different views of all that are available in the UK, and that's their job. But it's not necessarily the job to have 3 of this and 2 of that in every programme.
Okay, it just feels trade unionists are very rare on those programmes. You hardly ever see them. And Nigel Farage is the name that comes up. He was on Sunday again. It's been a momentous week.
He wasn't on Question Time. He was
to
on
anything at the moment.
Yeah, he was on the Laura Koonsberg show on Sunday morning.
Correct.
And the first
Another
time we've seen him for a
programme.
while. Yeah. No,
So,
I mean,
when
look,
he was an MEP, there were other MEPs, but he was on far more than anyone else. And he's not even elected to anything at the moment.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's the case, but nonetheless, the objective of it is to achieve a wide range of views and make sure that they're represented, so that the whole of the UK is represented, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, England, and all of the different political perspectives and views that are available, and also to make the programme entertaining and interesting at the same time. So all of those are objectives of the Question Time team, and if you look at it across the span of the programme, I think they do a very good job.
We get a wide variety of complaints in terms of people's assumptions around the panels or views around the panels. What I would say, if you meet the editor of Question Time or go and visit it, many of you will have done, Any Questions, I think you see a really high quality team. It's trying to get the balance right, is deeply attuned to the issues you're talking about in terms of the balance. And as David said, now and again you might have 2 people loosely, 2 people, there's a constant dialogue around that. They're wise people doing good things, is what I'd say.
It does feel... Okay, last on this, and then one small one.
Bring it in.
Just when John Barnes said, I think it was in the Gary Lineker scandal, BBC wants to pick and choose its impartiality. It does feel a bit like that. You said it's a watchword, but it seems a bit inconsistent. If you're recruiting to have an anti-liberal bias 1 minute and then...
We're not recruiting to have an anti-liberal bias. But you're just quoting a Telegraph headline to me based on some minutes. So I've just told you what the minutes were. There was a discussion around how do you... I've said this since I started this job, which is we do need people with different backgrounds and different points of view that come... different life experiences coming to the BBC. You don't want to have a media industry that's coming from the same type of people. That's nothing to do with left and right. It's why I've pushed a lot of money outside the M25. It's why you can become a network news editor now, not in London. It's why you can present a Radio 2 programme in Cardiff. I could go on. It's why we've got network radio stations in Manchester. That's why we're doing it. And that is about having people with different... It's nothing to do with adjusting a political set. It's to do with life experiences and different views.
There's been various complaints. It was mentioned about Mr Sharp, who's gone, but also Robbie Gibb. Lewis Goodall claimed that he made his life intolerable. There's been various editorial things that he was a previous number 10.
I think we're really clear that as editor-in-chief with the Deborah Turness in charge of news, we're the ones driving the newsroom and the coverage.
Okay, just last small thing. I was having a flashback to 2010, BBC's Tim Davie. I'm passionate about Radio 6, but it has to go. Amongst these, and luckily that did not come to pass, that was 2010. You had blacker hair, so did I, in those days. But look, with these local radio cuts, BBC Introducing is going to go. Jake Bugg, George Ezra, a whole load of new talent came through that stream. Is it, and I accept definitely, you've been dealt a bad hand.
We'll keep BBC Introducing, and it's very, very important.
Okay, I hope so.
Thank you very much. I think we're all going to now go off and Google Tim Booth to see if he's lost his looks. And in the meantime, I'd like to thank all of you for your time and forbearance today. We've covered a ton of different subjects. I think on behalf of the committee, we'd like to thank you for being so generous with your time today. And we'd be grateful if on the number of issues that my committee have raised, you'd write to us with the additional bits of evidence. Thank you very much. Order.